Chapter 31:29. As the communication continued to strengthen, the dynasty's world began to obtain additional opportunities to recover in addition to the means of the dynasty's ruler. The entire world was like a baby beast that was waiting to be fed, and it began to obtain endless existences from nothingness. The entire world began to expand in all directions at a speed visible to the naked eye. The vitality in the world also increased crazily during this process. The world, which had originally become desolate due to the transcendence of many empires, dynasties, and countries, became more and more lively as the vitality recovered. Of course, with the increase of living beings and the recovery of vitality, it was naturally impossible to directly return to how it was before the many forces transcended. Instead, it had to start from zero again, slowly moving from primitive to civilized, from disorder to order, and gradually bringing the entire world back to how it was before. Faced with such a situation, the dynasty's ruler finally let out a long sigh of relief. Although he had already obtained what he needed from the many rulers transcending, he was still rather concerned about this world. If there was no other way in the end, this world would definitely be damaged, and he could only accept it. He would not regret his decision because of this world's outcome. However, as long as there was a slight possibility of restoring this world, he would definitely put in all his effort for this outcome. Under such circumstances, he naturally let out a sigh of relief when he discovered that this world could recover at an extremely fast speed. As the world gradually recovered, the many concepts that he integrated into this world also began to undergo various subtle changes. During this process, each of these concepts began to evolve into all sorts of secondary existences, causing each of these concepts to gradually become colossal existences. It was as if the branches were gradually turning into tree trunks, and a large number of branches and leaves were growing again. In this process, the dynasty's ruler felt that his understanding of those concepts began to gradually deepen. These branches and leaves were derived from the concepts that he had sorted out. Their foundation could be said to be the concepts that he had sorted out. These derivations were like the position of the concepts in the world, their use in the world, their effects on the world, and so on. Through this elaboration, he even faintly felt that he could sort out more relatively perfect concepts. Of course, this was just an illusion. Although a worldview contained almost infinite concepts, not every concept could be seamlessly integrated into the worldview. Concepts that were derived from the concepts that he had already sorted out would obviously not be accepted by the worldview. For example, if someone wanted to collect all the fruits in the world, it was referring to a large number of different types of fruit. It wasn't as simple as picking a few types of fruits and stacking them on top of each other. In terms of the worldview, the ideas derived from these ideas were like the individual shapes of a certain fruit. Although it looked very different from the fruits he had collected before, the essence was still the same. Such a concept naturally did not help much in the establishment of a worldview. If he wanted to obtain other concepts, he would need to think about certain phenomena and explain certain phenomena that existed in the universe and even higher realms. Furthermore, the explanation had to be reasonable and logical, and it had to be in line with his true thoughts. Only then would he be able to form a new concept. In fact, he had already completed the most basic step on this point. Even if the concepts that he had established previously could only be considered to be a small and insignificant part of them, at least the remaining concepts were not without merit. At the very least, they had established the foundation of many concepts. After that, what the dynasty's ruler needed to do was to modify and rebuild these concepts that had not even reached a relatively perfect state. In the process of rebuilding, these concepts that still had huge loopholes and flaws would be perfected. Of course. In the process, he naturally still needed to explain more phenomena and establish more conceptual foundations. Just like that, he repeated the cycle again and again until he finally broke through the shackles and bottlenecks one by one. In the end, the concepts that he had truly established could form a complete and perfect worldview. By then, he would naturally become a true sage and obtain true eternity, true immortality, true indestructibility, true omniscience, true omnipotence, true omnipotence, true omnipotence, true omnipotence. Of course, although it was only a process, in reality, it was so difficult to truly cross this process that it simply surpassed the limits of all living beings' imagination. From the birth of a world until the end of time, it would take billions of trillions of years and billions of trillions of cultivators. If there were only a few dozen who could truly complete this process, it would already be considered a great fortune for the world. From this, one could tell how difficult it was to cross this process. At this moment, the dynasty's ruler naturally did not know how difficult this process was. At this moment, he did not think too much about what state he could achieve after establishing all the concepts needed for a worldview. At this moment, he only felt that this process was a form of cultivation, although he knew that it would be extremely long. However, in his heart, he did not treat this as a standard to measure his cultivation realm. In fact, he even began to think about how he should cultivate after establishing these concepts. Of course, such a shallow understanding could only be seen by a cultivator who was born and raised in this island branch like him. However, it was also because he did not truly understand the difficulty that he was full of confidence at this moment. He felt that he would eventually be able to complete this process one day. When the dynasty's ruler began to work hard to help this world recover to its original state, the cultivators who had transcended from the world that they ruled began to leave the transcendence passage one after another. Compared to the positions that the cultivators from the other island branches appeared after transcending from the world, the positions that the cultivators from the dynasty's world formed after transcending from the world that they ruled were rather special. This special characteristic caused an intense reaction from the yellow world that transcended from the world. Whenever a small world left the transcendence passage, the dynasty's ruler would feel its world tremble violently for a while. Vaguely, there was even some kind of inexplicable force acting on the dynasty's world, causing it to lift up a little in a certain direction. Faced with such a situation, how could the dynasty's ruler continue to immerse himself in this world? He naturally turned his gaze to the world outside. They've become a lower branch. With the help of the communication between the endless worlds, he soon discovered where the small worlds that had transcended from the dynasty's world had gone. The places where these worlds appeared were all under the dynasty's world. It was as if the dynasty's world was a layer below another world. However, what was different was that the worlds that had transcended from the dynasty's world were not stacked layer by layer. Instead, many worlds appeared at the same time and appeared side by side under the dynasty's world. If one were to make an analogy, the structure between the dynasty's world and the upper world, or even the upper world, was like a structure of bamboo joints. In other words, there was only one heaven and earth that came down from a higher level. If another heaven and earth wanted to join this system, it could only superimpose itself on the lower level of this heaven and earth, and become the lower level of this heaven and earth. Just like that, the layers of heaven and earth continued to be superimposed on each other. However, the situation in the dynasty's world was not like this at this moment. At this moment, there seemed to be densely packed roots under the dynasty's world, and a considerable number of small worlds became the lower world of the dynasty's world. There was no difference between the upper and lower worlds between those small worlds, and they were almost in a state of parallel. With such a structure, if the cultivators in these small worlds transcended, they would transcend to the same world no matter if they transcended inwards or outwards. It was not the same direction inwards and outwards, but the same world inwards and outwards were different from when they transcended inwards, but they were the same world to both parties. If they transcended outwards, they would naturally enter the dynasty's world. On the other hand, if they transcended inwards, they would transcend to the lower worlds of these small worlds. From a macroscopic perspective, It was as if a bamboo had suddenly split into a large number of branches when it came to the world of the dynasty. Then, these branches only lasted for one bamboo joint before they gathered again on the next bamboo joint. It looked as if a certain section of the bamboo had suddenly bulged out a big circle. With such a change, the communication between the dynasty's world and the other endless worlds suddenly skyrocketed. Or, to be more specific, the amount of information it received from the other worlds had suddenly skyrocketed. It was as if it had suddenly gained a large number of organs to receive information. Sensing such a change, the dynasty's ruler naturally understood that these small worlds that had transcended had also become its own world's organs to receive information from the other endless worlds. So, the world that transcends has such an effect. As he thought of this, he was slightly stunned. It was because he suddenly remembered that his dynasty's world seemed to have also transcended from another world. If the world that transcended would become the organ to receive information from the world before transcending, would his dynasty's world also become the organ to receive information from the world before transcending? However, it did not seem to be the case. At least, the dynasty's world was not directly on the next layer of the world that it had transcended from. This was fundamentally different from the other small worlds that transcended from the dynasty's world, which were on the next layer of the dynasty's world. Could it be because there are no powerhouses who have entered the tribulation in that world? The thought surfaced in his mind. With this thought, he heaved a sigh of relief. Although his dynasty's world becoming the organ to receive information from other worlds did not affect the dynasty's world much, and it would not be weakened because of this. On the contrary, it could faintly receive some kind of subtle enhancement. However, this was only a rational understanding. Emotionally, if such a situation happened, he would still feel a little uncomfortable. It was like a person knowing that he was a tool that was being used by others. Although such use would not affect him much, and he could even gain many benefits from such a use. However, even if one could see reality clearly, it was impossible for him to not have any grudges about such an encounter. In the depths of his heart, there was bound to be rejection towards this. If there were other choices, even if the benefits would be lesser, there would definitely be many people who would make other choices. It was the same for the dynasty's ruler. Although becoming the organ to receive information from the world that he had transcended would not affect him much, he did not feel great when he thought that his world was being used. If such a use required a powerhouse who had entered the tribulation in that world as a prerequisite, the possibility of it being used naturally did not exist. One should not forget how powerhouses who had entered the tribulation became. The achievements of powerhouses who had entered the tribulation completely relied on transcending the world. In other words, if there were no powerhouses who had entered the tribulation in that world, there would no longer be any powerhouses who had entered the tribulation in that world. After all, that world had already been formed. Even if there were cultivators in the upper worlds who had transcended the world, it would be impossible for them to enter that world. Therefore, if that was really the limit, it would mean that there was no possibility of the dynasty's world being used as an organ to receive information from that world. This naturally made him heave a sigh of relief. At this moment, in the many small worlds under the dynasty's world, the cultivators also broke through one by one. Not all of these cultivators who had transcended the world in the area they ruled were peak supreme emperors. There were also false saints and hopeless ones among them. After they transcended, although they had also broken through, not all of them could become powerhouses who had entered the tribulation. Only the breakthroughs obtained by supreme emperors after transcending the world could allow them to become powerhouses who had entered the tribulation. After false saints transcended the world, they only advanced their cultivation realm to the level of hopeless ones. On the other hand, after hopeless ones transcended the world, they only advanced their cultivation realm to the level of supreme emperors. Chapter 31:30. Of course, those false saints did not waste the opportunity to break through by taking such a huge risk to transcend. Although they did not directly become tribulation stage powerhouses, they had already removed the barrier between peak Supreme Emperor stage and tribulation stage powerhouses. In other words, although they were still despaired or Supreme Emperor stage powerhouses, they would naturally be able to break through this realm and become tribulation stage powerhouses when they reach the peak Supreme Emperor stage. Transcending this time was like planting the seeds of tribulation stage powerhouses in their bodies. When the time was right, they would be able to bloom and naturally become tribulation stage powerhouses. From a certain point of view, their method was even more brilliant than the method of those peak Supreme Emperor stage powerhouses. After all, those peak Supreme Emperor stage powerhouses had been stuck at this peak realm for trillions of years and suffered for countless times before finally obtaining this opportunity to break through. On the other hand, they did not need to go through this torturous process at all. As long as their realm was sufficient, they would naturally be able to break through. Apart from that, because their cultivation realm was insufficient, the tribulation they encountered when they transcended was much weaker than the tribulation the peak Supreme Emperor stage powerhouses encountered when they transcended. From this perspective, their chances of successfully transcending the tribulation were much higher. Of course, although there seemed to be benefits everywhere, this method was not without its weaknesses. The greatest weakness was that because their realm was insufficient, the area they could transcend was much smaller than those peak Supreme Emperor stage powerhouses. For example, cultivators who were originally peak-level Supreme Emperors, after they transcended from the world, their small worlds could easily transform into real world. However, they were different. Although they could barely transform their area of transcendence into a small world in the Transcendence Passage. However, if they wanted to nurture this small world into a real world, it was obviously not something that could be done in a short period of time. Perhaps only when they truly became tribulation stage powerhouses would they be able to transform this small world into a real world. Before that, the cultivator had to spend a lot of energy on this small world to maintain the integrity of this small world. He had to help this small world resist any pressure and danger that might affect the stability of this small world. On the other hand, this would obviously affect his cultivation instead, causing the speed at which his cultivation improved to be much slower than usual. Therefore, whether this choice was worth it or not, it was up to the individual to decide. At this moment, the transcendent cultivators were carefully sensing the changes in their territories and their bodies. As they successfully transcended the world, they began to sense an indescribable exchange of information between their own small world and the endless worlds outside. Endless information kept pouring into their small world, constantly enriching the foundation of this small world, pushing this small world towards the real world. At the same time, information continuously surged out of their mini-worlds and flowed into the endless world, causing the endless world to gradually undergo some insignificant and subtle changes. It felt as if they were breathing with each other. At the same time, they also sensed that there were some places in the endless world that they were familiar with. There seemed to be existences similar to them, in other words, he was also a transcendent being. After this period of time, the number of transcendent cultivators in the endless world increased a lot compared to before. After all, the development of different worlds was relatively independent. If they wanted to transcend, they would only look at their own situation. They wouldn't care about the situation in the other worlds, and they wouldn't care if other cultivators had already transcended. Therefore, sometimes there would be a long period of time without such a transcendent being appearing, but sometimes there would be a large number of such cultivators going to transcend. At this moment, there were already dozens of such transcendent beings in the endless world. This didn't include the people who had transcended from the dynasties. As the number of tribulation realm powerhouses increased, the number of interactions between them naturally increased. As the number of exchanges increased, the number of valuable exchanges naturally increased. The various characteristics of transcending the world were also gradually summed up in this kind of exchange. What were the limitations of transcendence? What were the advantages? What was the weakest requirement for one's cultivation base? How would the strength of one's cultivation base affect the tribulations they would face? And so on and so forth. All of this information was summarized as they conversed with each other. These transcendent beings all had different feelings for their own world. Some were extremely indifferent, feeling that everything they cared about had already transcended and left the world. Some still had extremely deep feelings for the world before they transcended. They felt that the world was still their root, and that the living beings in the world still had a different relationship with them. The transcendent beings who didn't have any feelings for their original world naturally wouldn't transmit the information they summarized back to their original world. However, those who had deep feelings for their original world wouldn't be stingy with this kind of effort. As long as cultivators made this choice, the information they summarized naturally wouldn't be a secret. Gradually, it would become common knowledge in the endless world. As this common knowledge was gradually made public, all kinds of transcendent beings gradually increased. For example, the false sage-level transcendent beings, the despair-level transcendent beings, and the supreme emperor-level transcendent beings appeared more and more in the endless world. Or rather, they appeared in different branches of the islands. After billions of years, the atmosphere of the countless islands seemed to be completely different from before. Personal transcendence was no longer the mainstream of the countless islands. Instead, it was the transcendence of the entire world. And in each island branch, there were more or less some worlds that had appeared due to the transcendence of the entire world. And in the endless communication between the worlds that only the transcendence could sense, the transcendence had already formed an extremely huge circle. Their ability to communicate across countless island branches allowed their knowledge to not be limited by a single island branch at all. Their understanding of the world, their understanding of cultivation, and their understanding of transcendence had already far surpassed the cultivators who were limited to a certain island branch. It could be said that in this aspect, even those sixth tribulation powerhouses who worked hard in a branch of an island and helped that branch to continuously improve and expand could not compare to them. This kind of change, however, made Luo Fan, who seemed to be in the midst of countless island branches at the same time, feel quite satisfied. The development in front of him was something he had not expected. It could be said that it was an unexpected gain. In the beginning, he had built this island in the layer of the nothingness ocean to imitate the cultivation of other cultivators. Even though he had finally built it, he was still at a loss about its use. In the end, because of a certain coincidence, he comprehended the essence of this island and understood that this island was a simulation of his own heavens. Through the communication between this island and the nothingness ocean, it could accelerate the communication between his heavens and the nothingness ocean, so that his heavens could evolve faster, so that he could move faster on the sixth level of the road to Tao Master, and also obtain more benefits that he wanted. After that, the many branches of the island served this purpose. By relying on the continuous branches of the island's tentacles reached more layers of the nothingness ocean, and finally, the island's communication with the nothingness ocean became more frequent, and the scale of the communication between his own heavens and the nothingness ocean became closer. The fact proved that he had made the right choice. From the beginning of his understanding of this key point, he could almost always obtain benefits from this island and its many branches that he could not obtain before. The speed at which his heavens evolved and the speed at which his cultivation realm improved were also much faster than before. From a certain point of view, from the beginning of the island's evolution to this step, all of this could be regarded as his plan. Even the development that he did not expect in advance did not exceed the framework of his final expectations. However, since the beginning of the dynasty's ruler's world transcendence, things became a little bit different. The emergence of world transcendence seemed to open up a whole new world, suddenly expanding the cultivation methods that originally did not have much future and redeeming features on this island and even the many branches of the island. Apart from leaving the island branches and leaving the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path, there was another possibility for the cultivators in the many branches of the island to break through. Although at the beginning they could barely step into the tribulation realm, it was obvious that this was only temporary. Compared to those who had world transcendence who still could not find their direction and did not know which direction to work towards to achieve further breakthroughs, Luo Fan, whose vision was far superior to those who had world transcendence, had long understood the direction that they should move forward in. At this time, the reason why these cultivators' cultivation realm was shackled at the tribulation realm and could not break through was because the types and number of heavens and earths that they could communicate with were too few. Because there were too few types of heavens and earths, they could not come into contact with as many types of heavens and earths as possible. It was difficult for them to understand the possibilities of heavens and earths, the possibilities of worldviews, the possibilities of rules and principles, and the possibilities of great Tao. There were too few heavens and earths, so they did not have enough samples to summarize the essence of a certain type of heavens and earths. Because of these two limitations, their current cultivation realm could only be stagnated at the tribulation realm. One day, when the types and number of heavens and earths met the requirements, this bottleneck would be broken by itself. At that time, the shackles of cultivation realm would also be relaxed to the second tribulation realm. After that, the types and number of heavens and earths would increase by several orders of magnitude. The second tribulation realm would no longer be an obstacle, and the final limit of cultivation realm would be relaxed to the three tribulation realm. Of course, it was obviously not that easy to increase by several orders of magnitude. At least, compared to breaking the shackles of the tribulation realm, the difficulty would at least be increased by at least 1,000,000 times. After that, the shackles of the three tribulation realm would also be broken through in a similar way. However, the difficulty might be increased by tens of millions of times on the basis of breaking through the shackles of the second tribulation realm from a certain point of view. The potential of the island branches could be said to be infinite. If they really developed to the limit, these island branches might even be able to cultivate the sixth tribulation realm. As long as the number and types of heavens and earths could meet the requirements, Luo Fan could clearly see this point, but he naturally would not directly tell this matter to the numerous transcendents of the island branches. First of all, the most important reason was that he was equivalent to an external force for the many island branches. If he personally told them things that they should not know, it might break the equilibrium of the many island branches. It would cause the communication between the island branches and the ocean layer of nothingness to be directly interrupted. If that was really the case, then no matter how many benefits the transcendents obtained from his reminder, it would be an absolute loss for him. Secondly, even if he didn't remind them, those who had transcended would only need a little more time to get the answer. Nowadays, the number of transcendents was increasing, and their communication was becoming more frequent and deeper. Naturally, they would have a deeper understanding of the direction of their cultivation. Grasping the essence and obtaining the final answer was obviously only a matter of time. In any case, the flow of time in the island branches was billions of times faster than in the outside world. Things that could be obtained by waiting for the passage of time were obviously not a problem for the island branches. Because of this, Luo Fan naturally would not waste his energy to take the risk of reminding them. Moreover, even if he did remind them, what could they do? Could it be that they could instantly break through just because they knew this, and instantly bring unimaginable benefits to the various island branches? Obviously, this was impossible. Even if they knew this, for the transcendents, it would only be able to sweep away some of the doubts in their minds. Chapter 31-31. At this moment, aside from the transcendents who had just appeared, there were also a large number of sixth tribulation experts among the many islands. Although the cultivation of these sixth tribulation experts was many times stronger than those who had transcended the world, because they were limited to the branches of the island, their understanding of the many branches of the island was not as good as those who had transcended the world. They did not even discover the existence of those who had transcended. In the senses of those sixth tribulation experts, these island branches weren't much different from before. They still needed to constantly create spacetime, transform it into a world, and finally evolve it into a world. In this manner, layers upon layers of spacetime would constantly increase the size of the island branches. However, it was clear that although they didn't know about the existence of the transcendent beings, when the scale of the transcendent beings increased to a certain extent and their influence on the various island branches increased to a certain degree, the sixth tribulation experts would eventually be able to sense something different through the changes in the island branches themselves. What's going on? It seems like the island branches have come to life. A sixth tribulation powerhouse felt the changes in the island branch he was on, and such a strange thought flashed through his mind. In his perception, the island branch he was on seemed to be growing on its own. It was as if the island branch would suddenly become stronger unexpectedly every once in a while, just like a living being that would constantly grow on its own, after discovering that something beyond his control was happening. How could this sixth tribulation powerhouse still dare to be as indifferent as before? At that moment, he focused his attention on the many worlds on the island branch and carefully observed the changes in the many worlds on the island branch. Some of the worlds in this island branch were inherited from the source of this island branch, which was also the island branch of the upper layer. The sixth tribulation powerhouse could not clearly sense these worlds, and he did not even know how many layers there were in those worlds, let alone determine the minute changes that were occurring in those worlds. However, this was only for the worlds that had originally been inherited from the island branch of the upper layer. As for the other worlds that he had nurtured, he did not have such restrictions at all. He could perfectly grasp all the details and changes of these worlds. At this time, he was completely focused on the worlds that he had nurtured, as well as the situation in the void where these worlds were located. From a certain point of view, his actions were obviously an absolutely wise decision to grasp the main point. Because the sixth tribulation powerhouse knew that the number of layers of heaven and earth in the island branch would be related to the benefits he would gain from the communication between the island branch and the endless void ocean in the outside world, the sixth tribulation powerhouse didn't slack off at all in helping the island branch grow. Through his efforts, the number of layers of heaven and earth in the island branch had already exceeded 10 million. Although it wasn't too difficult to grasp all the details and changes of so many worlds, it was clearly a rather complicated task. As such, during this process, the sixth tribulation powerhouse had no choice but to stop increasing the size of the island. In other words, he stopped increasing the heaven and earth level of this island branch. Once he stopped, tens of thousands of years passed. Over the past tens of thousands of years, he had been sensing the situation of the many worlds he could sense in this branch of the island. At the same time, he was sensing the situation of the void where those worlds were located. After waiting for tens of thousands of years, on this day, what he had been waiting for had finally happened. A new world has appeared out of thin air. No, it's not a real world, but a simplified version. Perhaps it can be called a small world. Moreover, it has the charm of transcendence. This is a small world that has transcended from a certain world. Is this world transcendence? Looking at the small world that had appeared out of thin air, the sixth tribulation powerhouse finally understood why he felt that this island branch seemed to have come to life. Someone actually chose to transcend the world, and this island branch actually accepted this kind of transcendence so generously? After understanding the reason, he couldn't help but feel even more surprised. He naturally knew what it was like to transcend the world. He also knew how difficult it was to do so. Normally speaking, unless one had unimaginably deep feelings for a certain area, one wouldn't take that area with him when he transcended. This kind of unimaginably deep feelings was definitely not a normal kind of deep feelings. Instead, it was the kind of deep feelings that required one to treat a certain area as one's own life. Obviously, this kind of cultivator was very, very rare. Cultivators' cultivation was a process of constantly improving themselves and surpassing themselves. Once a cultivator truly set foot on the path of cultivation, his life would become extremely long. During such a long period of time, almost no cultivator would stay in a certain place. Normal cultivators would constantly change their location during the process of cultivation. They would move space by space, world by world, and world by world. They would constantly surpass themselves and improve themselves, and during this process, they would constantly change their location. In this way, whether it was in terms of feelings or interests, it was obviously very difficult for them to have such deep feelings for a certain place. However, when there were enough cultivators, such cultivators would indeed appear. However, no matter what, it was impossible for there to be too many of such cultivators. At least, it was impossible to meet one every tens of thousands of years, but now, such a cultivator had appeared. This kind of transcendence had also successfully appeared before him. With the wisdom of this sixth tribulation powerhouse, he quickly understood that this kind of transcendence would bring unimaginable benefits to the cultivators who transcended. Only by doing this would it be possible for so many cultivators to choose to transcend the world. In fact, this kind of transcendence would bring unimaginable benefits to the island branch. Only then would the island branch easily allow these cultivators to transcend. The second point was that this kind of transcendence would bring benefits to the island branch. This kind of transcendence would also bring benefits to the island branch. Just like how he was helping the island branch to continuously expand, the appearance of these transcendents would have a similar effect. The appearance of these transcendent beings represented a new world. Their presence on this island branch was equivalent to providing assistance to the expansion of the island branch. This was naturally not a small benefit for the island branch. As such, the island branch would accept the transcendence of these cultivators and even facilitate their transcendence. However, he could understand the second point. As for the first point, he didn't know what benefits this kind of transcendence would bring to the cultivators who chose to transcend. Since he didn't know what to do, there was no need to say anything else. With a thought, the sixth tribulation powerhouse's body flickered, and he arrived outside this world. He looked down at this world, or rather, this small world. At this moment, this small world was constantly absorbing nutrients that the sixth tribulation powerhouse could not understand from the void. These nutrients were absorbed into this small world to help it continue to grow, evolve, and transform into a true world. It's not absorbing nutrients from the island branch. Did it appear out of thin air, or did it absorb nutrients from other places? Looking at this small world, the sixth tribulation powerhouse had this doubt in his mind. In his doubt, he faintly felt that he had overlooked something very important. Perhaps there were some secrets that he had neglected for a long time in the bodies of these transcendent beings. This void was the sixth tribulation powerhouse's territory. Although he couldn't completely control this void, he had a certain amount of authority here. For example, the fact that he was able to appear here from his original location in the blink of an eye and appear outside this small world was one of the manifestations of this kind of authority. However, this authority didn't include entering and exiting this world. This was because this world wasn't created by him. Moreover, this world didn't truly belong to this void. Even though this small world was a small world, it still had an owner. It was easy for this sixth tribulation powerhouse to destroy this world, but it wasn't so easy to enter and exit this world. At the very least, without the permission of this world's ruler, it would be very difficult for him to directly enter this world. Looking at this small world, the sixth tribulation powerhouse understood this point. Thus, he didn't attempt to enter this world. Instead, he directly sent a strand of his aura into this world. In an instant, this strand of aura directly enveloped this small world. Every living being in this small world could clearly sense this strand of aura belonging to this sixth tribulation powerhouse. The moment they sensed this strand of aura, an indescribable sense of panic spread throughout this small world. What kind of existence was a sixth tribulation powerhouse? Four peak seventh tribulation powerhouses like Luofan, who had even sensed the arrival of the eighth tribulation, sixth tribulation powerhouses were like ant. However, to those who had undergone the five tribulations and below, such an existence was an absolute powerhouse. Just a strand of aura from such an expert was enough to cause a world to sink and destroy it. Even the owner of this small world, a newly ascended transcendent who had already entered the tribulation, couldn't resist this strand of aura at all. Answer my question. This information was instantly transmitted to the strongest existence in this small world through this strand of aura. In other words, the heart of the transcendent. After sensing the information contained in this strand of aura, the newly ascended transcendent who had just entered the tribulation became terrified without hesitation. Through this wisp of aura, he could clearly tell that the owner of this aura did not even need to do anything. As long as he released the restriction on this wisp of aura, then his small world, which he had paid such a huge price to bring him to transcend, would completely collapse. Even if he reversed time and space, it would not be able to recover. Under such circumstances, how could he resist the will of this strand of aura's owner? Of course, he would obediently become terrified. "Senior, please instruct me," the newly ascended transcendent hurriedly said. As he spoke, he established an extremely subtle connection with this strand of aura. Through this connection, the sixth tribulation cultivator easily cast his gaze into this small world, then directly stared at the newly ascended transcendent. In just an instant, the newly ascended transcendent felt an indescribably terrifying gaze land on him. All of his secrets seemed to be swept clean by this terrifying gaze. So this is the benefit of transcending the world. The moment the sixth tribulation cultivator saw the newly ascended transcendent, he completely understood what was going on. He no longer had any doubts about the benefits that the newly ascended transcendent could obtain from this process. How did you know that transcending the world would allow you to break through? He immediately gave up on his original question and changed the topic. Reporting to Senior, this is something I comprehended when I was comprehending the world. It seems to be something I obtained when the world I was born in interacted with the other worlds. The newly ascended transcendent answered without hesitation. Facing an expert he couldn't resist, it was better to be obedient. In any case, this information wasn't related to his own secrets, so he could tell it to anyone without any burden. Of course, even if this information was related to his own secrets, he didn't mind telling this information to the sixth tribulation cultivator. After all, with such a difference in strength, what he thought to be a secret might just be superficial in the eyes of the other party. Under these circumstances, offending such a powerful sixth tribulation cultivator for these so-called secrets that didn't have much effect on the other party was simply a foolish choice. The natural exchange between the world and the other worlds? The other worlds? Hearing this, the sixth tribulation cultivator's expression changed slightly. Chapter 31-32. The sixth tribulation powerhouse felt as if the fog in front of him had been swept away. He was well aware of how many worlds there were in an island branch. Even if it was the island branch from the previous round of branching, which was also the source of this island branch, all the worlds in the branch had been divided into the island branch that he was currently on. In addition to the worlds that he had opened up, the total number of worlds could be calculated in the tens of thousands. No matter what, this number could not be called endless worlds, But at this time, the person who transcended the world was talking about the boundless heaven and earth. There could only be one truth. That was, the worlds that could communicate with those worlds were not limited to this island branch, not even limited to the source of the island branch, but all the worlds in all the island branches. Only such a scale could barely be called endless worlds. Putting himself in their shoes, if he were to call those worlds, they could only be called endless worlds if the scale of those worlds was so large and the number of worlds was increasing at every moment. All the worlds can communicate with the worlds in all the other island branches? This thought emerged in the sixth tribulation powerhouse's mind. At this moment, he suddenly began to envy those transcendent. After all, if that was the case, it meant that the worlds that those transcendent came into contact with were many times larger than his. In fact, the short period of time he exchanged for the exchange of hard work for this island's branch might be something that they could sense at all times, although in terms of level, the level of communication they sensed might be a little lower than what he wanted to sense. It was still somewhat similar. But it was worth paying a great price for it. Transcend the world, transcend the world. At this moment, he could not help but have an inexplicable desire to become such a transcendent. Compared to ordinary cultivators who needed to learn how to transcend the world through the communication between worlds, as a sixth tribulation powerhouse, he did not need to go through this process at all. Although it was rare to see a transcendent, with the knowledge and ability of a sixth tribulation powerhouse, he should know what to do. As he thought of this, he no longer had the intention to waste time with this transcendent being. Without even saying a word, he abruptly withdrew his aura, and his figure directly left the detection range of that small world. That transcendent realm expert was nervously waiting for the next action of that inconceivable expert. However, he did not expect that all the pressure would suddenly disappear without a trace. Everything had been restored to its original state before the appearance of that terrifying expert, causing him to be unable to react for a while. After waiting for a few days, he was finally convinced that the incredible expert had completely let him go. He finally relaxed. There is actually such an incredible expert in the endless world. Sure enough, even a breakthrough is not the end. After relaxing, an inexplicable excitement emerged from the bottom of his heart. Part of the reason why he became a transcendent was that he did not want to leave that area of the world. More importantly, the transcendent could give him a chance to break through of the world. In other words, transcending the world was beneficial to his cultivation. Under such circumstances, having the space and opportunity to take a step forward was clearly the greatest encouragement for him. Then, with a thought, he directly pressed the information into the pocket world, allowing the information to spread to every corner of the world through the communication between the pocket world and the other endless worlds, allowing all existences that could absorb information from the world to know that there was such an unimaginably powerful existence in the endless world. The reason why he spread this information to the endless worlds was not because he had the spirit of sharing. Rather, he clearly knew that it was not enough to explore the path to take a step forward on his own. Only with a large number of people of the same path could he finally explore the path to take a step forward. And if he wanted more people of the same path to take a step forward, he naturally had to give them enough confidence. Only when they all believed that there was a path to take a step forward, a space to take a step forward, and a possibility to take a step forward, would they pour their wisdom and energy into this kind of exploration. It was precisely because of this that he decided to share his findings with others. This information quickly stirred up an intense reaction in the endless world. The first to discover this information were naturally the people who had transcended. Although any world with sufficient cultivation could comprehend the world and obtain the information between the endless worlds, it was clear that only the people who had transcended could sense this information the clearest and the most convenient. After all, other cultivators still had to enter a profound state of resonance with the heavens and the earth in order to sense the various information that existed in the heavens and the earth. As for the people who had transcended, just by existing in the small world that they had transcended, they could sense the information between that world and the endless worlds at all times. In this way, they did not even need to spend any effort to sense it. They only needed to distinguish it, and they would naturally be able to find this information from the endless information. With this kind of convenience, it could not be more normal for them to know this information before other living beings. After learning this information, the first thing they naturally did was doubt. This was even more normal. They believed that they were already standing at the pinnacle of cultivation. Even breaking through to the Supreme Emperor realm had consumed all of their wisdom and energy. In the end, if they had not used the method of transcending, they would not have even been able to achieve this critical breakthrough. Under these circumstances, they were suddenly told that their current breakthrough was only a breakthrough at an extremely low level, and that there were terrifying experts who were countless times stronger than them. It went without saying how much of a blow this news was to them. This was practically looking down on their intelligence and denying all their past efforts. Even though these supreme transcendents were outstanding existences in their own world, they still couldn't accept such a situation without hesitation. However, there were always traces left behind. The sixth tribulation experts had clearly left behind too many traces in the endless world. Not to mention anything else, most of the worlds that these transcendent experts lived in before they transcended were created by these sixth tribulation experts. Under such circumstances, there would naturally be countless traces left behind by these sixth tribulation powerhouses in this world. They did not discover these traces before, not because these traces did not exist, but because they did not think in this direction and did not search in this direction. At this time, when they received information about the possible existence of a sixth tribulation expert from the endless communication between the heavens and the earth, no matter how suspicious they were, it was impossible for them to ignore it. They would naturally think of ways to confirm it and search for traces of the existence of such an incredible expert in everything they could come into contact with. As long as they began to search, these traces would truly appear in front of them. For example, the traces of aura left behind by the sixth tribulation experts when they created the world. For example, the influence of the sixth tribulation experts' beliefs on the world. For example, the traces left behind by the sixth tribulation experts' power in the world. For example, the traces left behind by the sixth tribulation experts' power in the world. And so on and so forth. As long as one wanted to find these traces, they could find as many as they wanted. If the cultivators of a single world wanted to find these traces, even if they found them, they would not believe that these traces belonged to such incredible experts. However, it was clear that it was not just a small number of such experts who began to search for these traces. A large number of cultivators in the world were also searching for these traces. In that case, when they discovered that there were similar traces in many worlds, and that these traces were faintly different and could complement each other and combine into a more complete whole, no matter how stubborn they had to admit that such a terrifying expert did exist. Moreover, they had to admit that the world they were born in was created by such an expert. From knowing this information to completely confirming it, it only took these supreme transcendents a few days. A few days later, the news that there were unimaginable powerhouses in this boundless world had already become common knowledge. However, after analyzing the countless traces, the cultivators in the endless world began to have another misunderstanding. Can one reach that realm with just one breakthrough? If that's the case, this path might not be as easy to open as imagined. This was the worry of the supreme transcendents who wanted to open a further path. The reason why they were so worried was not complicated. It was because the traces of those unfathomable experts that they had found clearly indicated that even though there were many of them, their levels were not much different. According to their estimations, they should generally be existences in the same realm. In this endless world, apart from tribulation experts like them, the only traces that could be found were the incredible experts in the same realm. In this case, what would the supreme transcendents think? They would naturally feel that as long as they went up this realm, they would be in the realm of the incredible expert. After all, if there really was an intermediate realm, how could so many incredible experts coincidentally be in the same realm? Take them for example. Even though there was an extremely high threshold for this kind of transcendence, those who could ultimately transcend the world were not just peak supreme martial emperors. There were also many false saints and despairing people who created the impossible, leading the area that they cared about to transcend the world and successfully becoming a transcendent being. Even supreme transcendents like them, who had such a high threshold, had different realms. How could these existences who could survive in this endless world and create worlds at will be in the same realm? This realm was actually the only realm above the tribulation expert. Below this realm were the realms they were familiar with. This could explain this phenomenon. Because of this, they had such a misunderstanding. From a certain point of view, this understanding would obviously make it more difficult for them to open a higher path. After all, it was clearly not easy to cross 5 or 6 realms as one realm. However, although opening a path would be more difficult, if they really had great wisdom and perseverance to open such a path, perhaps their future would be so bright that it would be astonishing. While many supreme transcendents were trying to confirm some common sense that they had long ignored, the sixth tribulation expert who had come into contact with the supreme transcendents directly entered the world. He had opened up and began to use his authority to carefully sense this world. The key was the communication between this world and other world. There really is communication. After carefully sensing this world, he suddenly discovered the existence of that extremely subtle communication. As the creator of this world, although he only determined a part of the world's concepts, rules, and principles, as well as a part of the great Tao, this was enough for him to have far more authority than the supreme transcendence in this world. With this kind of authority, he could sense even more than those who had transcended the world. Therefore, very soon, he discovered when this kind of communication appeared. Clearly, this kind of communication did not exist from the beginning. At the very least, when he had just opened up this world, this kind of communication did not exist. Otherwise, with his authority, he would have discovered this kind of communication a long time ago. In fact, this kind of communication suddenly appeared out of thin air a period of time ago. To be more specific, it was billions of years ago. It was as if, billions of years ago, a subtle change had suddenly appeared on the branches of the unknown islands, causing this kind of communication that did not exist before. Chapter 31-33. Billions of years ago seemed to be the time when those who transcended all over the world appeared. The sixth tribulation expert's heart skipped a beat as he linked the two time points together. According to his investigation, billions of years ago happened to be the time when those who transcended all over the world appeared for the first time. Billions of years ago, there was a communication between heaven and earth that transcended the restrictions of the island branch, which was enough to make him suspect that there was a certain causal connection between the two. It seems that the emergence of those who transcended all over the world has greatly improved these island branches. At this moment, the sixth tribulation expert had already understood. As he understood this, he suddenly felt that the island branch he had stayed in for a long time seemed to hide many more profound mysteries that were far beyond his imagination. At this moment, he suddenly felt that he had chosen to stay in this island branch. If he had made the other choice back then, the deeper mysteries hidden in this island would have had nothing to do with him. Since those who transcended all over the world could have a certain authority that was far beyond that of sixth tribulation experts, It was impossible for the sixth tribulation expert not to try to become a transcendent himself. At this time, he entered the world he had created in order to try to become a transcendent himself. He did not care about the breakthrough that could be obtained after transcending all over the world, because he clearly knew that such a breakthrough could not happen to him. After all, he was already a sixth tribulation expert, and this was still the sixth level of the Tao Master's road. Perhaps it was possible to break through in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, but it was almost impossible for a cultivator to surpass the level limit and step into a higher level of the Tao Master's path. Even if there was a seventh tribulation powerhouse behind this island branch, it was impossible for him to directly break through the sixth tribulation powerhouse and step into the seventh tribulation powerhouse behind that powerhouse. At least, it was impossible to achieve this with just this island branch or even all the island branches. What he cared more about when he tried to transcend all over the world was obviously the authority that those who transcended all over the world possessed, the authority that was beyond the coolies like him. As the creator of this world, as long as he wanted to understand it, he could naturally have a deep understanding of this world. Through this understanding, he quickly determined where he should start. With a slight thought, his figure flashed, and he replaced the ruler of a certain force in this world. This was not the kind of replacement that ordinary living beings could imagine. Instead, it was a complete replacement from the very foundation, in terms of karma, in terms of existence, in terms of fate. In other words, from now on, everything in this world would only treat him as the existence that he had replaced, and they would completely forget about the existence that had been replaced. In fact, even if it was the records of the world, even if one transcended time and space to investigate the past and the future, they would only be able to come to the conclusion that he was that existence. There would be no other conclusion. As for the existence that was replaced, it naturally disappeared without a trace. After replacing this existence, he did not hesitate at all. He used the connection between this existence and his faction to directly start the process of transcending the world. Compared to peak supreme emperors, those in despair, and those false saints who had to spend endless time and effort to prepare and plan, it was many times easier for this sixth tribulation powerhouse to start transcending the world. With just a thought, tribulations started appearing. They used all sorts of unimaginable methods to cover him, as well as the areas that he wanted to lead the world to transcend, as if they wanted to completely destroy everything. Such tribulations were enough to make peak supreme emperors extremely nervous. They could even cause them great damage. However, for this sixth tribulation powerhouse, he only needed to wave his hand gently, and the endless attacks from the tribulations were completely eliminated. Not only did the attacks from the tribulations disappear, but the tribulations themselves, the source of the tribulations, also started to collapse and disappear. Not long after, the world became clear again. Then, the endless light of transcendence enveloped the sixth tribulation powerhouse's body. At the same time, it also enveloped the territory of the sixth tribulation powerhouse, completely enveloping the area. It even completely separated it from the outside world, causing it to gradually form a small world of its own. The light of transcendence became denser and denser, more and more intense, and more dazzling. In the end, when it became as bright as the sun, the world shook violently. Then, the small world disappeared along with the sixth tribulation powerhouse. From the moment the sixth tribulation powerhouse started the process of transcending the world to the moment he transcended the world with his territory, the entire process only took a few breaths. From the beginning until now, not many of the other cultivators in the world were able to react and understand what was happening. As for those cultivators who barely managed to react, although they also extended their senses to this location and barely saw the process of the sixth tribulation expert leading his forces to transcend the tribulation, none of them were able to truly understand what was going on. Some suspected that it was transcendence because the speed was simply too fast. The entire process was completely different from what they knew about transcendence, so they couldn't believe that it was really transcendence. As a result, all sorts of rumors naturally appeared in the world. Some said that this area was punished by the heavens, so it was erased by the world. Some said that the forces in this area dug up something and angered the world, so it was destroyed by the world. Some said that the forces in this area dug up something and angered the world, so it was destroyed by the world. And so on and so on. There were all sorts of rumors, but no one said that this area was transcendence. After all, no matter how daring one was to imagine it, they couldn't believe that such a short period of time would take decades, centuries, or even thousands or even tens of thousands of years to complete the process of transcendence. But it was actually completed in such a short period of time. Naturally, the sixth tribulation powerhouse wasn't interested in the various messages he left in the world. At this moment, he had already stepped into the transcendence passage with his territory and headed towards the void on the other side of the passage. When they were in the passage, these sixth tribulation experts, who already knew about the process of world transcendence, naturally did not waste any time. They immediately began to reconstruct their own sphere of influence. Although this sphere of influence was already like a small world under their initial construction. But in the end, it was not a small world. In the end, the connection between it and that part of the world still existed. Only when they completely broke away from the other world and gained independence could they truly transform into a small world. With the means of the sixth tribulation powerhouse, it wasn't difficult for him to transform an area into a small world. In less than a few breaths' time, the area that originally only had a small charm of the world had completely turned into a complete world. There was even a barrier of the world on the surface of the world, making it truly independent and not dependent on anything else. When this small world was completely formed, the transcendence passage naturally came to an end. They directly rushed out of the transcendence passage and entered a void. From the moment they stepped into the transcendence passage to the moment they rushed out, the sixth tribulation powerhouse sensed that only a few breaths had passed. Compared to ordinary cultivators who had transcended on their own, this amount of time was countless times faster, let alone compared to other cultivators who had transcended all over the world. It could be said that the time the sixth tribulation powerhouse spent in the transcendence passageway had once again broken the record for the shortest time a transcendent had spent in the transcendence passageway. However, as a sixth tribulation powerhouse, he naturally wouldn't feel any emotional fluctuations over breaking this record. At this moment, he had already used his special authority in this branch of the island to confirm the location of his small world. It was not under the world that he had chosen before, but under the countless worlds that he had constructed. Above the worlds and spacetime that he had constructed that had yet to transform into a world, he was in the deepest part of the island branch. In other words, he was in the deepest part of the island branch, the position closest to the absolute void within the island branch. At the very least, from the perspective of the world, so this is the structure. Upon seeing this, the sixth tribulation powerhouse couldn't help but come to a realization. He understood the final arrangement rules of this transcendental small world. He also understood why he hadn't been able to sense the existence of these small worlds before. After all, the locations of these small worlds were too subtle. Although they seemed to be inserted into the worlds that he had constructed, because he couldn't directly sense the existence of these small worlds, they didn't exist in his senses. It was similar to the situation in the previous island branch, where there were a large number of sixth tribulation powerhouses in the same island branch. Back then, although those sixth tribulation powerhouses were in the same island branch, they couldn't sense each other at all. Even though the worlds that they had created were closely attached to each other, they couldn't sense the existence of the worlds that weren't created by them, let alone the existence of the sixth tribulation powerhouses who had created those worlds. At this moment, these small worlds that had transcended clearly inserted themselves into their own worlds in a similar way. Of course, compared to the previous situation, the current situation was still different. This kind of isolation obviously wouldn't last long. When these small worlds grew into complete worlds, this kind of isolation would disappear unknowingly, causing these worlds to be brought into the sixth tribulation powerhouse's senses once again. It was precisely because of this that the sixth tribulation powerhouse had the opportunity to discover the existence of these transcendental beings. It was just that the disappearance of this kind of isolation was too natural, almost silent. As a result, the sixth tribulation powerhouse usually didn't discover these worlds appearing out of nowhere. This was like a rice grain suddenly appearing in a bowl of rice. No matter how sharp a person was, they wouldn't be able to discover this so easily. Only when they occasionally glanced over would they discover that there seemed to be something different in the place that originally didn't have the rice grain. Only when they carefully compared it to their memories would they discover that there was an extra rice grain there. Just like what the sixth tribulation powerhouse had done previously, after sensing the location of this small world for a while, he began to focus his attention on this small world. More specifically, he focused on the connection between this small world and the other endless world. This kind of connection appeared in the form of communication. Endless information continuously flowed out of the endless worlds and poured into this world. At the same time, a lot of information flowed through the information channels and into the other endless world. During this process, various changes began to appear in this small world. The world kept growing, the laws were constantly perfected, the great Tao began to take shape, and so on and so forth. All the other factors necessary for a complete world were rapidly perfected through this communication. This situation looked as if the endless world was helping this small world grow at the same time. Is this the power that allowed them to break through? Immediately afterwards, the sixth tribulation powerhouse's heart stirred. He carefully sensed the indescribable charm that had appeared out of nowhere. As this small world constantly communicated with the endless worlds around it, there was also an indescribable charm that appeared out of nowhere. It descended upon him and continuously seeped into his body and mind. During this process, it seemed to be constantly breaking down some subtle shackles in his body and mind, allowing him to step into an indescribable realm of liberation. However, it was a pity that this charm might be more than enough for a supreme emperor, enough for him to become a tribulation powerhouse. However, for a sixth tribulation powerhouse like him, this charm was far too weak. He even had to sense it extremely carefully to be able to sense the effects of this charm. He even needed to sense it carefully to be able to sense its effects, let alone use it to help him become a seventh tribulation powerhouse. It could be said that even if this charm was 1,000,000 times stronger, it might not necessarily be enough to push his cultivation realm forward. Chapter 31-34. Feeling the effect of this charm, the sixth tribulation expert was quite impressed. This charm obviously contained some mystery that he could not understand. This mystery had even given these island branches the power of the Tao Master's path to a certain extent. Although this power was only at the first level of the Tao Master's path, it was obviously only temporary. There was no such charm before, but now it had appeared. Who knew what the development of these island branches would be like in the future? At least, even the sixth tribulation expert had many ideas about the development of these island branches. He had some guesses about how to enhance the power of these island branches in this aspect. Not to mention the existence behind this island branch that was obviously many times more powerful than him. Therefore, he was sure that the current limit of these island branches was not their real limit, but only their temporary limit. Thinking of this, he began to focus on the authority that he had obtained after becoming a worldly transcendent, the ability to communicate with other endless worlds. In an instant, an unprecedented world appeared in front of him. The sixth tribulation expert, who could only limit his vision to the island branch where he was, suddenly saw an endless world appear in front of him. This endless world was like an endless number of stars, dotting the boundless dark void. In this endless world, he could even feel tens of thousands of familiar auras. Those auras belonged to other Sixth Tribulation experts. As expected, they have surpassed the island branches. Such a thought flashed through his mind, confirming his previous guess. The worldly transcendent is the real protagonist of these island branches. This thought appeared in the Sixth Tribulation expert's mind. But thinking about it, it seemed to be reasonable. For the island branches, the increase of the world was equivalent to the expansion of their scale, which was equivalent to their own growth. Under such circumstances, the addition of a transcendent realm expert was equivalent to the addition of a new world to the island's branch. Once this direction of cultivation became mainstream, countless cultivators in the endless world would work hard to help these island branches expand in scale and strengthen themselves. If he was the existence behind these island branches, he would also provide a lot of convenience to the countless worldly transcendent. Maybe I should remind them. Slightly moved, the Sixth Tribulation expert thought. The them he was referring to was not the worldly transcendent or other cultivators who were not even worldly transcendent, but the existence of the Sixth Tribulation expert like him. It wasn't because he had the spirit of sharing. It was just like how the person who had transcended the world had immediately shared the existence of the Sixth Tribulation expert. It wasn't because he had the spirit of sharing. The reason why he did so was because he needed companions, needed people like him. After all, although there were so many worldly transcendent in the various island branches, he was the first to become a worldly transcendent as a Sixth Tribulation expert. What would be the consequences of doing so? How could he utilize this additional authority to the limit? How could he combine this authority with the authority he obtained from helping the island branch to expand in scale to bring greater benefits to himself? Everything was obviously not something he could do on his own. Just this reason alone was enough for him to share the news that a Sixth Tribulation expert could become a worldly transcendent and obtain an increase in authority. Not to mention, even if he didn't share this information, the other Sixth Tribulation experts would know about it one after another in the near future. Compared to letting them discover this information themselves, it was clearly more beneficial for him to share this information with them first. After all, if they discovered this information themselves, it was clearly their own ability and had nothing to do with the Sixth Tribulation expert. However, if the Sixth Tribulation expert shared this information with them, then even if they were unreasonable, they would still owe him a favor. Perhaps it would not be much, but it was better than nothing. It was precisely because of these various reasons that he directly shared this information at this time. As for the method to share it, there was no need to mention it. As the creator of the world, he was very clear about how to make the creator of the world interested in the information in one of his worlds. At this time, he directly transmitted a large amount of repeated information to the many worlds that gave him a sense of familiarity. Even if this constantly repeated information appeared in one of the worlds, it would be enough to attract a lot of attention. Moreover, the Sixth Tribulation expert was not just injecting this information into one of the worlds, but into a large number of worlds at the same time. This way, even if the Sixth Tribulation experts did not pay attention to the worlds that they had already established, they would definitely notice this information. Things were indeed as the Sixth Tribulation expert had guessed. As this information was transmitted, the Sixth Tribulation experts in different branches of the islands quickly learned of the existence of the worldly transcendent. They also learned about the special authority that the worldly transcendent could obtain from the island branch, or rather, the existence behind the island. After a series of confirmations, it did not take long before the second worldly transcendent at the Sixth Tribulation level appeared. This was followed by the third, the fourth in just a few short days, almost all the sixth tribulation experts in the many branches of the islands had already become worldly transcendent. With this change, the number of worldly transcendent experts at the sixth tribulation level in the endless world was already several times more than the number of worldly transcendent experts of other levels. At first, it was only a worldly transcendent expert at the sixth tribulation level, so it naturally did not attract too much attention from the other worldly transcendent experts. After all, the scale of the endless world was so large that it was not surprising that there were some special worldly transcendent experts. But now, as the number of transcendents at the sixth tribulation level had increased to an unknown number of tens of thousands, the situation was completely different. From this moment on, all the worldly transcendent experts instantly discovered that their positions among the worldly transcendent experts had suddenly been pushed to the bottom. The interaction between his own small world and the small worlds and the small worlds and the small worlds and the worlds of other transcendents seemed to have become an unequal interaction. The information that the other worldly transcendent experts received from their own small worlds and those of the other worldly transcendent experts kept increasing. Meanwhile, the amount of information that their own small worlds and those of the other worldly transcendent experts received from their own small worlds and those of the other worldly transcendent experts kept decreasing. This kind of situation was like the communication between subordinates and their leader. Obviously, if the leader wanted to know, the subordinates could only answer honestly without leaving out any details, not daring to be negligent in the slightest. As for what the subordinates wanted to know, it depended on whether the leader wanted them to know or not. If the leader was willing to let you know, you would naturally be able to know. But if the leader didn't want you to know, unless your methods were brilliant enough, it was impossible for you to know. At this time, the relationship between the Transcendent Realm experts and the Transcendent Realm experts of the sixth level was similar to the relationship between subordinates and leaders. As for those supreme transcending experts of the sixth tribulation level, they simply had no ability to resist. As long as those supreme transcending experts wanted it, as long as they had it, that information would uncontrollably flow to the small world or world of those supreme transcending experts. On the other hand, ordinary transcendent transcendents were powerless against the small worlds of transcendent transcendents at the sixth tribulation level. The information they could obtain was merely scraps of information that the transcending experts of the sixth tribulation level didn't care about. Of course, even so, it was more than enough for those who had transcended all over the world. Although the information he obtained was only a fragment of the information revealed by those transcendent experts at the level of sixth tribulation experts, it was just a piece of information. Even so, these scraps of information were enough for these supreme transcendents to feel that they had gained a lot. It was just like the idle chatter between leaders. For those leaders, it was just some gossip and didn't have much meaning. However, to his subordinates, these gossips had a completely different meaning. Perhaps this could increase their knowledge, allowing them to understand how the higher-ups thought, or perhaps they could learn some higher-ups' secrets through gossip. In the end, with the help of these secrets, they could gain benefits that they had never dared to imagine before. At this time, this was clearly the case for those supreme transcendent. At this moment, most of the transcendents at the level of the sixth tribulation were just communicating with each other through the authority that was beyond the limits of a certain island. They didn't have much interest in communicating with ordinary supreme transcendents. However, the spirit they revealed in the process of communicating, the perspective of observing heaven and earth, the island's branches, and the perspective of observing cultivation were enough to broaden the horizons of those supreme transcendents and benefit them immensely. Thus, after the transcendent transcendents at the sixth tribulation level began to communicate with each other, the communication between ordinary transcendent transcendents had decreased a lot. Clearly, they were already doing their best to absorb the scraps of information revealed by the supreme transcendents of the sixth tribulation level. All of this had been of great help to them, allowing their understanding of cultivation and their understanding of the path forward to improve by leaps and bounds. When the communication between the supreme transcendence of the sixth tribulation level stabilized and gradually decreased to a normal level, many of the ordinary transcendents had already made great progress. Each and every one of them felt as if they had been reborn and reborn from before. So it turns out that one's own view is so important. Looks like I have to change my previous way of thinking. This thought flashed through the mind of the first supreme transcendent, who was also the ruler of the dynasty. Originally, although he valued his own view, he didn't think that it was very unique. He just felt that there was a certain standard for this view. Collecting such views was like picking up grains of sand from a boundless ocean of eternal sand. With this understanding, he even had the thought of exchanging views with other supreme transcendent. After all, according to this understanding, he could also use the views of other supreme transcendent. In that case, if he were to exchange a relatively perfect concept that he had mastered with them, it would be equivalent to him mastering two relatively perfect concepts. And if the number of views exchanged increased to thousands, then the number of relatively perfect views he had would also increase by thousands. In that case, if this kind of exchange was extended to countless supreme transcendents, then perhaps just one relatively perfect view could be exchanged for countless relatively perfect views. In that case, it wouldn't take long for him to collect all the views that could form a relatively perfect view of the world. But now, after understanding the uniqueness of views, he understood that this kind of exchange was meaningless. Perhaps the views of others were relatively perfect to others, but to him they were meaningless views. They couldn't even be combined with his original views, let alone a perfect combination. Only the views that he concluded based on his own way of thinking, his understanding of the world, his understanding of the heavens and earth, his understanding of the myriad worlds, his understanding of the state of chaos, and even his understanding of the primordial world could be considered as his own views. Only when these countless views were combined could he truly form a unique view of the world that could support him to ascend to an unimaginably high realm. After realizing this, the ruler of the dynasty naturally started to modify his original plan. The intention of exchanging views was immediately erased. Although it was still necessary to communicate with the other supreme transcendents, the focus of that communication was no longer on views. Instead, it was something more abstract that was beyond the views. For example, the direction of cultivation. Naturally, there were many supreme transcendents who had the same understanding as he did. Very soon, the communication between the various supreme transcendents gradually increased, and the focus of their communication also unknowingly shifted to various abstract directions. Chapter 31-35. The direction of cultivation was also all-encompassing in all aspects. Even if it was just an abstract direction, there were still countless points that could be researched. Thus, these supreme transcendents didn't need to worry that their interactions would become meaningless. On the contrary, not having to interact with specific concepts meant that they didn't need to worry about minor disturbances. Indeed, their interactions became even more efficient. In addition, they obtained bits and pieces of information from the interactions between the supreme transcendents at the sixth tribulation level. This made the progress of these supreme transcendents quite obvious. Very quickly, in less than tens of thousands of years, a general cultivation system was sorted out by them. This specific cultivation system didn't involve concept. Although concepts were unimaginably important in cultivation, due to the relative independence of each concept, they had no choice but to eliminate this incomparably important factor. In the end, in this cultivation system, they directly treated the sixth tribulation level as the next great realm for their cultivation. However, they had also come into contact with the transcendent experts of the sixth tribulation level before, and they knew how great the gap between them and the sixth tribulation experts was. They understood that it was nearly impossible to reach the sixth tribulation level in a single step. Since it was impossible to reach the heavens in a single step, there was only one way: to construct an indefinite number of traps between these two realms. In fact, what these transcendent experts had been trying to determine over the years was how many levels there were between the two realms. At first, some supreme transcendents thought that it would take tens of thousands of levels, while others thought that it would take thousands of levels. Some even thought that it would take hundreds of levels. In fact, even those who thought that it would take at least 33 levels. However, after coming into contact with those sixth tribulation experts and interacting with each other, their understanding of the sixth tribulation experts became deeper and deeper. This allowed them to have a deeper understanding of the difference between them and the sixth tribulation level. In this way, after tens of thousands of years of communication, they finally confirmed one thing. The number of sets they needed to fight against a sixth tribulation expert at their current realm was at least 5 levels. From this point of view, the moment they set foot on the 5th level would be the moment they would become the 6th level expert. From a certain perspective, the results of their interactions were quite remarkable. Although it was different from the real situation, they had come in contact with the truth from another angle, or it could even be said that they had come in contact with it from another direction. But this was also to be expected. None of these cultivators who were able to open up a path of transcendence from despair were simple cultivators. Their understanding of cultivation and the improvement of the essence of life was not something that ordinary cultivators could compare with. Although the sixth tribulation level experts stood higher than them, that was only because the sixth tribulation level experts had come into contact with things that ordinary cultivators couldn't compare to. If the sixth tribulation level experts were placed in the same environment as the supreme transcendents, then the supreme transcendents wouldn't be any weaker than the sixth tribulation level experts. Under these circumstances and with all sorts of traces, it wasn't surprising that they were able to discover the true gap between realms. Although there was still an unimaginably long way to cross this gap, at least they could see the direction and hope. In the following period of time, the supreme transcendents began to use their own methods to explore in the opposite direction, searching for a fulcrum that could support them further, trying to find a way to set foot on the 5th level. However, it was clear that this wasn't an easy task. At the very least, in the current environment, this was a nearly impossible task. Time slowly passed, and before they knew it, 10 billion years had passed. After 10 billion years of development, the supreme transcendents had truly become the absolute mainstream of the many island branches. All sorts of methods to transcend the world had already been summarized, becoming common knowledge in the various island branches of the land of no family. At this point, transcendence was no longer something that depended on luck. Over the past 10 billion years, many methods of transcending the world had been discovered. How to find the most suitable method of transcending the world for oneself, how to modify the method of transcending the world for oneself, and so on had become a fixed subject. Any cultivator who wanted to transcend the world could find the most perfect method of transcending the world for himself through this subject. This minimized the risk of transcendence. At the same time, because the study of transcendence had become so deep, the current transcendence was no longer the same as before, where anyone could transcend if they wanted to. Because the appearance of every supreme transcendent would cause some sort of damage to the world, after 10 billion years of research, in order to prevent the world from suffering unbearable damage, the unattached lands now knew exactly what frequency of transcendence should be used to minimize the damage to the world. How large must the scale of transcendence be in order to achieve a state of balance between the world and oneself? As a result, most of the worlds now had organizations that were qualified to manage the world's transcendence. Any cultivator who wanted to transcend the world had to first apply to this organization, and it would coordinate with them. Only after obtaining the right to transcend the world could they attempt to transcend the world. For the unattached lands, the emergence of this organization was practically a leap in civilization. It allowed the development of the unattached lands to become more orderly and stable. Of course, the establishment of this organization had not been smooth sailing. The organization had first appeared in one of the worlds, but after its establishment, it had not received the approval of the cultivators who wanted to transcend. After all, I'm going to transcend with everything I care about, so who cares about your world? Moreover, after I transcend, what can your organization, which is limited to this world, do to me? Since they did not care about the state of the world, and the organization did not have the ability to restrict them, how could they pay attention to an organization of supreme transcendence established in one of the worlds? In the end, the organization of supreme transcendence could only be established because, as the number of supreme transcendence increased, the communication channels between the unattached lands became incomparably smooth. Because the communication channel became incomparably smooth, from a certain point of view, the unattached land had already become one. The fates of different worlds were not completely linked, but they were intimately connected. For example, if a disaster with boundless poison appeared in a certain world, it could easily be transmitted to other worlds through this communication channel. For example, if a new technology appeared in a certain world that could bring about certain benefits to the world, it could easily be transmitted to other unattached lands. Under these circumstances, the appearance of an organization of supreme transcendence, which was of great significance to the world, was naturally recognized by many worlds, receiving the support of the unattached lands. In the end, this organization, which had only appeared because of a certain cultivator's sense of responsibility, became a behemoth that spanned across the unattached lands. Many worlds supported each other, and there were even a large number of transcendents participating, forming a deterrent force towards those who attempted to transcend in almost every aspect. Before the entire world transcended, the members of the organization in the world could deter the cultivators who attempted to transcend. Once the cultivator successfully transcended and became a supreme transcendent, the other supreme transcendents in the unattached lands could also act as a deterrent. Although supreme transcendents could not directly interact with each other with their true bodies, the exchange of information was enough to accomplish many things. It was not that they could not act as a deterrent without their true bodies entering other worlds. As for how to act as a deterrent, it was a relatively simple matter. For example, they could process information and turn it into a book of information that could distort and pollute information. They could also send information beings over, and so on. It was extremely difficult for a single supreme transcendent to deal with another supreme transcendent. Even after a great deal of effort, the other party's development would only slow down. However, if the number of supreme transcendents was not a single person but multiple, the situation would be different. As long as 10 supreme transcendents acted at the same time, it would be enough to cause the development of one supreme transcendence world to stagnate. And if more than 10 supreme transcendents acted at the same time, it would only be a matter of time before that supreme transcendence world or land began to degenerate. Afterward, as the number of supreme transcendents increased, the resulting attack would become stronger. When more than 100 supreme transcendents acted, it would be enough to cause the world or land of a supreme transcendent to fall into the apocalypse. Thus, even if their true bodies could not cross the unattached lands and enter other worlds, the existence of supreme transcendence would still be a great deterrent to those who came after them. And how many supreme transcendents were there in this organization that had grown to the point of crossing the unattached lands? Almost all of them. In other words, almost all the transcendents in the world were members of this management organization. Of course, this was not because all supreme transcendents were aware of this. Rather, as the organization grew larger and larger, if one did not join, one would become the target of public criticism. one's benefits would no longer be guaranteed. Thus, even if they did not have the sense of responsibility to treat the unattached lands as their home, even if it was to ensure that they did not become a minority, they had no choice but to join the organization. With so many supreme transcendents joining this organization, it was too easy to find more than 100 supreme transcendents who were intent on punishing those who violated the organization's rules. Therefore, even those who had transcended would still be greatly deterred after they had transcended and reached the heavenly Tao. It was precisely because of this omnipresent deterrence that the rules set by the organization became the fundamental rules of the Land of No Family, making the Land of No Family even more orderly and stable. In the past, 10 billion years ago, there would occasionally be a world that would fall silent due to too many supreme transcendents, and it would take a long time for it to recover. But now, even if supreme transcendents continued to emerge from the unattached lands and join the family of supreme transcendents, there were very few worlds in the unattached lands that would fall silent because of this. After such a long period of development, the number of supreme transcendents in the unattached lands had already surpassed 10 billion. This number far surpassed the number of sixth tribulation experts and became the main body of supreme transcendence. Because of the increase in their numbers, they were more confident in dealing with the transcendent experts of the sixth rank. At the very least, when facing the sixth-level supreme transcendents, they dared to try to infiltrate the circle of the sixth-level supreme transcendent. However, it was clear that this infiltration was meaningless to the sixth-level supreme transcendent. Even if their numbers were much lesser than the average transcendent transcending expert, their strength was still much stronger than the average transcendent transcending expert. This difference in strength allowed them to disregard the average supreme transcendent. Moreover, the goal of the sixth-level supreme transcendence was fundamentally different from that of the average supreme transcendent. The goal of those who had transcended all over the world was to find the next step, so that they could step into the sixth tribulation expert level. But for the sixth-level supreme transcendents, their goal was to wait for the island branch to grow to a certain limit and once again let them experience the inconceivably grand interaction between the island branch and the ocean of nothingness in the outside world. Everything else was just preparation for this kind of interaction. Whether it was now that they had become supreme transcendents, communicating with each other in the unattached lands, or constantly working hard to expand the size of the island branch, they were all preparations for this goal. This difference in goals meant that the interaction between the two circles was close to zero. Chapter 31-36. While these changes were happening to the island branches, in that mysterious place that seemed to be far above the many island branches, Luo Fan had entered a state of indescribable stillness. At this moment, his entire body and mind had fused with the many island branches. At the very least, this was his entire body and mind. In this process of fusion, he seemed to have become the many island branches. Everything in these island branches and all living beings were like the basic units of his body. Although everything that happened was different, as a whole, it directly merged into a complete him, the true him. In the past, when there were not so many transcendents, this feeling had existed, but it had never been as complete as it was now. The feeling of the countless island branches becoming the basic units of his body and mind was more like an abstract feeling, as if an ordinary person would feel that the clothes on his body were a part of him. For the average person, they would not distinguish the clothes they were wearing from themselves when they were in a situation like this. Once they put on the clothes, they would naturally feel that their body and the clothes they were wearing were themselves. But clearly, although there was such a feeling, in reality, the clothes were still the clothes, and the person was still the person. In the end, the two were not one. In the past, for Luo Fan, the island branches were like the clothes he was wearing. Although he felt that he had become one with these island branches, they had become an important part of his body and mind. But in reality, these island branches were still island branches, and the world in these island branches was still the world. There was still a barrier between them and his body and mind that was difficult to cross. It was like a person's clothes. When you wore them, you naturally felt that they were one with you. But clothes were still clothes. If you took them off, they were just a pile of cloth. But now, after the number of transcendents had increased to this level, this situation had clearly changed. Now, these island branches, these world, were no longer just clothes that had fused with him. Now, they had all become cells in his body, an incomparably important part of his body and mind. It was like the clothes had become his skin. With this deeper fusion, Luo Fan felt that the communication between the island branches and the void behind them was more than 100 times clearer. Moreover, he did not need to read this communication to know. Now, it was as if this communication was happening between him and the void behind him. It was as if it was not the island branches or the world in these island branches that were communicating with the surrounding void, but he himself was communicating with the surrounding void. In this state, he no longer had the mind to pay attention to any developments in his island branches. Even if the sixth tribulation experts had become transcendents, even if they had established huge organizations, even if they had directly seized the authority to manage the transcendents, it was the same. From the moment he entered this state, everything was equivalent to the interaction between the various parts of his body and mind. Clearly, unless there was a problem with his descent, very few people would be interested in the interaction between the various parts of his body. In this state, the current Luo Fan looked like he had transformed into the countless island branches of the supreme heavenly Tao. It was just that he was subconsciously controlling all the changes in the island branches. This state made his control much more rigid and inflexible than before. However, at the same time, after this change, the many island branches and unattached lands would also become more stable, and it would be harder for any abnormal changes to occur. This was clearly a good thing for all the living beings in the island branches. The reason why the increase in the number of transcendents would cause this change was actually not complicated. It was because the appearance of the transcendents had built a large number of communication channels between the island branches. These communication channels were a way for the transcendents to communicate with each other. It was even where their hopes of advancing further in their cultivation lay. However, for these island branches, the appearance of these communication channels was like blood vessels that connected the many island branches even more tightly. These island branches had originally branched out layer by layer from the same island, and they themselves already had a rather close and fundamental connection. However, this connection only existed at the root, in the depths of these island branches. If one compared them to ordinary objects, these branches were more like countless seedlings on a tree, or countless branches and leaves. Such a situation also made these islands look like an inseparable whole from a more macro perspective. However, this could only be seen from a broader perspective. From a normal point of view, the connection between the many island branches was still too weak. It was precisely because this connection was too weak that Luo Fan had previously felt that these island branches had already fused with him, but there was still a layer of separation in the end. He had only treated them as something like clothes. However, the situation now was clearly different. With the appearance of the communication channels between the many transcendents, they had paid a huge price to barely strengthen this originally weak connection. Through the strengthening of this connection, these island branches finally completely fused with Luo Fan, allowing him to evolve from clothes to skin. In this inexplicable state of mind and body, Luo Fan felt that his body was improving at every moment. The connection between his body and the nothingness of the outside world was also strengthening at every moment. The difference between the scale of communication between his body and the nothingness of the various heavens and himself was becoming smaller and smaller. Of course, in terms of the standard of communication between the various heavens and the nothingness, this gap was still quite shocking, but it was not that easy to overcome. However, even though the gap was still very large, it was still constantly shrinking. For Luo Fan, this feeling was still quite wonderful. Just as these earth-shattering changes were happening in the many island branches, the many Sixth Tribulation powerhouses who were originally waiting for an opportunity to enter the island branches gradually felt that the island branches in front of them seemed to have become more dangerous, but also more tempting. This feeling was so wonderful that it made the many Sixth Tribulation powerhouses feel rather uneasy. If these Sixth Tribulation powerhouses were all in their true bodies, many of them would have turned around and left. After all, although they could feel that the secrets contained in these island branches seemed to have increased by a lot, the opportunities that they could bring to them also seemed to have increased by a lot. However, the sense of danger that was constantly eroding them had also increased by a lot. If the sense of danger in the past was only limited to the possibility that the island branches might delay their cultivation, then the sense of danger now was already a feeling that their lives were in danger. In other words, in the past, the senses of the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses told them that if they entered the island branches to explore, they might be trapped and their cultivation would be delayed. However, now their senses told them that if they entered the island branches to explore, not only would they be trapped, but they might even lose their lives. With this sense of danger, no matter how much they desired to improve themselves, it was impossible for them to easily make up their minds to enter. After all, this was not their only hope to improve. However, it was obvious that this situation did not occur. None of the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses here were in their true bodies. They were either clones, incarnations, or projections. Some were even just puppets. Under such circumstances, their ability to withstand danger was obviously many times stronger than their true bodies. With this unimaginable ability to withstand danger, how could they easily give up on the island branches that had clearly become more tempting and the opportunities within them seemed to have become stronger? As a result, the number of Sixth Tribulation powerhouses around the island branches had increased at some point. However, the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses who had their connection with their incarnations severed because they offended Luo Fan were not among them. When they sensed that the island branches had begun to change, they had already left one by one. Now, this sense of danger had increased to the extent that it could bring danger to the lives of Sixth Tribulation powerhouses. How could they still stay here? God knows how long he had been cultivating in his down note. Although it was a little dangerous and a pity to give up on his incarnation and not take it back. However, this kind of danger and pity seemed insignificant compared to the sense of danger that the island branches gave him. Unknowingly, there were already a large number of Sixth Tribulation powerhouses surrounding the island branches in the back layer of nothingness. Looking at the density of the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses, it was not much worse than the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses around the countless worlds of laws in the back layer of nothingness. If there was an essential difference, it would probably be that the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses around the countless worlds of laws had too many repetitions, while the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses around the island branches didn't have many repetitions. Of course, it couldn't be said that the attraction of these island branches to the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses had increased to the point that they were not any worse than the worlds of laws. The reason why the liveliness outside looked so similar was because the worlds of laws didn't restrict living beings from entering, but these island branches restricted cultivators from entering most of the time. In other words, although the number of Sixth Tribulation powerhouses around the worlds of laws seemed to be similar to the number of Sixth Tribulation powerhouses in these island branches, it was only because more Sixth Tribulation powerhouses had already stepped into the worlds of laws to contribute to Luo Fan's cultivation. Of course, this was obviously only temporary. Although the attraction of these island branches couldn't be compared to the worlds of laws, it was only temporary. After all, the flow of time in these island branches was simply too fast. With such a fast flow of time, the development of these island branches would also be unimaginably fast. With such an unimaginable speed of development, one day, the level of these island branches would eventually catch up to the worlds of laws. And once their level caught up, the attraction of the sixth tribulation powerhouses would naturally catch up to the worlds of laws. At this time, there were even many sixth tribulation powerhouses secretly guessing which of the two was stronger in the end. They even began to wonder if the existence behind the island branches had some kind of contradiction with the existence behind the worlds of laws. At this point, no matter how stupid they were, they had already guessed that the existence behind the island branches and the worlds of laws were at least seventh tribulation powerhouses. Two different seventh tribulation powerhouses had appeared on the sixth floor of the Tao Master's Road at the same time and were cultivating in such a similar way. No matter who it was, they would link the two together. As for why they guessed that this connection was not complementary, but contradictory, the reason was even simpler. After all, their appearances were so similar. Wasn't this the reason why the sixth tribulation powerhouses had to make a choice? This was actually not a good thing for both of them. If they were separated by time and there was only one special hesitation at the same time, the attraction to the sixth tribulation powerhouses would obviously become stronger. In that case, the benefits that each special hesitation could get would of course be greater. It was precisely because of this idea that they guessed that there might be contradictions between the existences above the seventh tribulation powerhouses behind the two. However, it was obvious that they had not guessed that the same expert behind the two was Luo Fan. In fact, if there were really two different existences, their way of thinking would naturally be correct. However, if that was not the case, according to Luo Fan's current method, it would actually be more beneficial for him. Chapter 31-37. Although the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by these two existences at the same time would be much less than the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by each of them individually. However, if one were to look at the total number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by these two existences, the number would obviously be much more than the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by each of them individually. In this way, there was no need to say more about what to do to benefit Luo Fan the most. If these two existences were to be pushed out individually, the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses he would attract would obviously be much less. And if these two existences were to be pushed out at the same time, the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by each unit of time would obviously be much more than the former. In this way, if the total number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by each region was calculated, the total number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by the latter would obviously be more. Looking at a fixed period of time, if they were to be pushed out individually, the fairest way would be to evenly divide this period of time into two sections. One of the sections was the branch of the island, and the other was the projection of the world. In this way, the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by the first section and the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by the second section would add up to a huge number. And if these two regions were to be pushed out at the same time, there was no need to divide this period of time into sections at all. This period of time would be directly treated as a whole. And in this way, the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by the branch of the island and the projection of the world would obviously be more than the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by a single region. In this way, after repeating this unit of time to this fixed period of time, the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses attracted by it would naturally be much more than when they were separated. This kind of judgment was actually not difficult. As long as one knew that there was the same existence behind these two, not to mention those sixth tribulation powerhouses, even an ordinary person with a bit of rationality would be able to make this judgment. However, it was a pity that these sixth tribulation powerhouses did not know that there was the same existence behind these two. Therefore, they could not make this simple deduction. Another few breaths passed. The branch of the island changed again. The difference in the flow of time inside the branch of the island and the outside world was really too great. A few breaths outside were equivalent to hundreds of millions of years inside. After such a long period of time, the internal development of the island branch had been so smooth. There was no need to say what the result would be. In just a few breaths of time, the island branches had become complete and it was time for them to branch out again. The island branches began to flicker with an indescribable brilliance. Immediately after, the originally sealed paths for Sixth Tribulation experts to enter those islands were once again opened up. The clones, incarnations, projections, and even puppets of the Sixth Tribulation experts had already made all preparations under the urging of their main bodies. At this moment, even though the island branches were about to change and the risk was much greater than usual, they couldn't resist the orders of their main bodies and charged into the island branches. In the blink of an eye, the void around these islands became empty. Although not every Sixth Tribulation expert charged into the island branch, 99% of them clearly did. The remaining Sixth Tribulation experts' clones, incarnations, projections, and the like were the ones who suddenly had some unexpected changes. Once there were a lot of people, it was naturally impossible for everything to go smoothly. Accidents were bound to happen. Perhaps their power was suddenly thwarted, or their mind was thwarted, or they were disturbed by other Sixth Tribulation experts, or maybe their main bodies suddenly changed their minds. There were only a few Sixth Tribulation experts left. They frowned and looked around, as if they were reconsidering what to do. Obviously, there would be such Sixth Tribulation experts every time. Even if they did anything, there would be such existences. Sometimes, because of such accidents, they would obtain unexpected benefits and avoid unexpected dangers. But most of the time, such existences were unlucky and missed out on opportunities. For those Sixth Tribulation experts who didn't enter the island branch together as they did before, those who successfully entered the island branch were inexplicably shocked at this time. It wasn't because the first layer of the island branch they entered was quite special. If the world was special, no matter how special it wouldn't be surprising for these Sixth Tribulation experts. After all, the heaven and earth, world, space-time, universe, and even the level of the Tao Master that they had seen were already beyond the imagination of ordinary cultivators. For them, they were already tired of seeing any kind of heaven and earth. If it was just the abnormality of the heaven and earth, it would only surprise and amaze them. At most, they would just praise it, but it would never make them feel shocked. At this time, the source of their shock was not the heaven and earth itself, but the information contained in the heaven and earth when they all entered the first layer of the island branch. As Sixth Tribulation experts, they didn't enter these island branches to do hard labor. Even if they had to do hard labor in exchange for benefits in the end, they wouldn't use this goal as a guideline before they were really forced to that extent. They entered these island branches in order to thoroughly understand the mysteries contained in these islands and find the secrets contained in these island branches that were beneficial to their cultivation and benefit them. Under such circumstances, when they entered this island branch and stepped into the first layer of the island branch, the first thing they did was, of course, to feel and understand the heaven and earth. Therefore, at this moment, they would immediately start to sense the information contained in this world and experience the various subtle secrets that might exist in the depths of this world. And it was this behavior that made them feel indescribably shocked. At this moment, they seemed to be connected to an indescribably great sense, as if they were absorbing endless nutrients from the endless mysterious existences around them at every moment. At every moment, they could feel that they understood all kinds of mysteries that they couldn't understand before, and they knew countless truths that they didn't know before. These mysteries and truths were so profound and mysterious. In the process of absorbing these truths and mysteries, they felt that their cultivation realm seemed to begin to accumulate some kind of inexplicable power, and began to attack the cultivation bottleneck that they had encountered before. How is this possible? Is a seventh tribulation expert really so much stronger than a sixth tribulation expert? This was the thought that came to the minds of those sixth tribulation experts. At this time, the incredible changes in the world that they had entered had far exceeded their imagination. They could naturally obtain endless benefits just by being in it, and the characteristics that could allow their cultivation realm to rise endlessly was something that they didn't even dare to think about before. To be able to do this, to be able to open up such an incredible world, the brilliance of the existence's means was far beyond the limits of their imagination. And what kind of existence was the creator of all this? It was an unknown existence that they suspected to be a seventh tribulation expert. How could they not be shocked by the brilliance of the seventh tribulation expert's means? At this time, even some sixth tribulation experts began to suspect that the existence behind this island branch was not only a seventh tribulation expert, but also an eighth tribulation expert. Only in this way could they understand the inconceivable ability he had displayed. There seems to be a layer. At this time, in different branches of the island, some sixth tribulation experts discovered this point one after another. Although they could feel the indescribable information constantly pouring into their minds, this information still seemed to be separated by a layer. Although it could allow them to obtain great benefits, it felt like it was separated by a layer of glass. Looking at something through a layer of glass could indeed enhance one's understanding of that thing. However, a layer of separation was still a layer of separation. No matter how much this kind of understanding was enhanced, it would obviously be missing an important link, such as taste, touch, and so on. At this time, this was what those sixth tribulation experts felt. The information that kept pouring in did indeed bring them a lot of benefits, making them feel that their cultivation realm was rising bit by bit. But in the end, they still felt like they were scratching an itch through their boots, as if something was missing no matter what. This feeling made many sixth tribulation experts feel quite annoyed. What should we do? This question kept lingering in their hearts. It should be known that for them, it was fine if they didn't know they could obtain benefits. Now that they knew they could obtain benefits, and that this benefit was separated by a layer due to certain circumstances, how could they accept it? Therefore, at this time, they naturally wanted to break this shackle and dig out all the benefits. Transcending the world. Soon, they found a possibility from the information in that world. After the appearance of the transcending the world, the endless worlds in the branches of the island had, to a certain extent, become one. As a result, there was more or less information exchange between all the worlds. Since there was an exchange of information, some common knowledge that existed in the endless world would naturally be transmitted to every corner of the endless world. Among them was the first level of the islands where the sixth tribulation experts were. Therefore, they could obtain the secret of transcending the world from the information in that world. As long as the whole world transcends, we can strengthen the communication with the endless world. In that case, we should be able to break through this barrier. The execution ability of those sixth tribulation experts was beyond imagination. After knowing this, they quickly started to take action. For the sixth tribulation experts, transcending the world couldn't be more simple. Even under normal circumstances, the sixth tribulation experts didn't see many times of transcending the world. However, as long as they knew the concept and understood the principles behind it, it would only take them a moment to create the corresponding method. Therefore, they didn't even need to look at the various strange methods of transcending the world contained in the information of the world. They only needed to know the concept of transcending the world to naturally know what they should do to be the most beneficial to themselves. With this change, the sixth tribulation experts soon began to replace some of the supreme emperors in the world. They took their forces as their own and began to try to transcend the world. However, soon, the world shook. An unimaginable sense of danger instantly eroded the sixth tribulation experts who tried. "We're going to die." This was what the sixth tribulation experts felt at this moment. This feeling told them that if they continued to try to transcend the world, there was only one fate waiting for them: death. How is this possible? If they can transcend the world, why can't I? The expressions of the sixth tribulation experts changed. They felt as if their worldview had been turned upside down. From the information, they clearly knew that there were billions of people who could transcend the world in this endless world. Among them, there were even false sage existences who could try to transcend the world. This clearly showed that there weren't many thresholds for transcending the world. Even if there were limitations because they were too powerful, this wasn't right. Although it wasn't clearly stated, they could still feel from the information that there were many of the people who could transcend the world who were like them. In other words, they were also sixth tribulation experts. This meant that the strength of sixth tribulation experts didn't exceed the limits of the people who could transcend the world. If that was the case, why would they feel such a sense of danger when they wanted to transcend the world? This was not the situation described in the information that could happen when one transcended the world. If it was an ordinary cultivator, he would probably be dumbfounded by this situation. However, it was obvious that the person who appeared here was not an ordinary cultivator, but a sixth tribulation expert. As sixth tribulation experts, the limits of their thinking ability were obviously beyond imagination. Therefore, very soon, some sixth tribulation experts understood what was going on. It's the timing. The timing isn't right now. This conclusion was quickly found by them, and it was quickly accepted by many sixth tribulation powerhouses. It seems that opportunities to obtain nutrients for breakthroughs are not always available. At the same time, they also understood this point. Chapter 31-39. Thinking that those six tribulation experts might be in the world they had created after they had transcended, these six tribulation experts naturally did not hesitate. Although there were many six tribulation experts in the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, it was impossible for any two of them to have many friendship. However, they were all of the same kind and they were all six tribulation experts. In this branch of the island there was still a little friendship between them. For example, it was like meeting a fellow villager in a foreign place. In fact, there were quite a lot of people in one's hometown. If they were just fellow villagers in one's hometown, how could they have any friendship? Maybe they disliked each other and occasionally scolded each other. However, if they were in a foreign country, the situation was obviously different. Encountering someone from the same hometown in a foreign country, even if it was someone they disliked, was very different from encountering someone else. The common attribute of being from the same hometown would make them have a friendship that they did not have in their hometown. At this time, the situation was the same for those six tribulation experts. The sixth level of the Tao Master's Road outside was their hometown, and this branch of the island was equivalent to a foreign country. Obviously, they did not have much friendship with each other in their hometown or in the outside world. However, the common attribute of six tribulation experts coming from the outside world was enough to make them have a little friendship with each other. Of course, it was naturally impossible for a sixth tribulation expert, who was a transcendent, to sacrifice his own interests to benefit them. However, some things that wouldn't harm the sixth tribulation expert was beneficial to them. This little bit of kindness was enough for the other party to do it for them. Because of this, these sixth tribulation experts began to use all kinds of methods to contact the world that they had experienced before, the world formed after the transcendence of a sixth tribulation expert. Not to mention that the endless worlds were closely connected now, there was a connection between any two worlds, which made this kind of cross-world communication extremely easy. Even if there was no such connection, with the ability and means of these six tribulation experts, it was quite a simple thing for them to establish such a connection. Therefore, very soon, countless inquiries were transmitted to the world where the six tribulation experts who had become a transcendent were. And naturally, this was also transmitted to the hearts of the 6 tribulation experts who were hiding in these worlds. There was only one 6th tribulation expert in each island branch. In other words, the number of worlds created by a 6th tribulation expert who had transcended the transcendent realm was the same as the number of worlds created by the transcendent realm expert who had transcended the transcendent realm was the same. In other words, the number of 6 tribulation experts corresponding to the 6 tribulation experts who had come earlier was calculated by tens of thousands. One corresponded to so many. As long as any of the 6 tribulation experts contacted the 6 tribulation experts and took action, the 6 tribulation experts who had come earlier would naturally receive the information of these 6 tribulation experts. Obviously, with so many latecomers, there were bound to be some who more or less thought like this in any of the island branches, and they also did the same. Therefore, the transcendent transcendence of the 6th tribulation level in every island branch would naturally receive their messages. Although the time might not be the same, some might receive it immediately, some after a few months, and some after a few years. The final result was the same for each branch of the island. In fact, this was something that the 6 tribulation experts would normally do. And when the number of people who would normally do something increased to a certain extent, it would become something that they would inevitably do. Therefore, there was no need to describe the situation of each branch of the island. Just by looking at the situation of one of the islands, one would be able to see the situation of the tens of thousands of islands. Do you want to know what benefits we have obtained? At this time, the first transcendent received a message from a certain 6th tribulation expert and couldn't help but reveal a faint smile. At this moment, he had turned into the heavenly Tao and fused with the world that he had brought with him. After a long period of development, this place, which was originally just a small world, had now become a complete world. Moreover, it wasn't just complete. Due to the nurturing of the 6 tribulation experts, this world had been strengthened to an unimaginable level. Although it was still some distance away from a perfect world, it was already enough to become the most perfect world in this branch of the island. Be it the breadth or depth of the world, the stability of time or space, the perfection of rules and laws, or the various other factors that belong to the world, all of them had reached a level that surpassed any part of the world in the branch of the island. Back then, when the 6 tribulation experts entered this world, they were still shocked by the wonders of this world for a long time. However, because their goal was to explore the deepest secrets hidden in this branch of the island, they did not stay on this side of the world. I can only tell you that this benefit is tens of thousands of times better than what you have obtained in the void. He immediately sent this message to the 6th tribulation powerhouses who were inquiring about him. After that, he couldn't be bothered to pay attention to the 6 tribulation experts at all. Even after that, the 6 tribulation experts continued to send him all kinds of information to ask him about the specific situation. After all, at this moment, the most important thing for him was to use his identity as a transcendent and the laborer of this branch of the island to absorb as much of the nutrients that leaked out from the process of communication between this branch of the island and some incomparably grand existence in the outside world. Through this kind of absorption, one's own cultivation realm could be improved at every moment and be sublimated. Under such circumstances, every minute and second was extremely important to him. Being able to give them an answer was already a sign of him caring for his fellow countrymen. How could he waste more time on those 6th tribulation experts and delay the process of obtaining benefits for himself? Very soon, the 6 tribulation experts who came later understood this point. The information they sent became fewer and fewer, until it finally disappeared completely. Looks like the benefits are beyond imagination. This judgment was also agreed by many 6 tribulation experts at this time. For a moment, an inexplicable expectation and hesitation appeared in the hearts of many 6 tribulation experts. Expectation. Naturally, They were looking forward to the benefits that were tens of thousands of times greater than what they were getting now. But hesitation was because they didn't know whether it was true or false. They didn't know whether it was a trap, and they didn't know whether there were hidden dangers in it that they didn't know about. After all, everything was based on their own speculations and the words of others. Under such circumstances, how could they be so sure of their own judgment? Of course, with expectation, their next decision was already determined. After all, they were only clones, incarnations, and projections. They weren't their true bodies. As this type of existence, their resistance to disasters was unimaginably strong. Or rather, their endurance was unimaginably strong. Even death was nothing to these 6 tribulation experts. Perhaps for these incarnations, clones, and projections, death was the end, and it was absolute despair. But for the true bodies of these 6 tribulation experts, it was just a little bit of power. In this way, with expectation, no matter how great the risk was, it was enough for them to stay on this branch of the island. As a 6 tribulation expert who transcended the world, they could obtain endless benefit. But now, the time wasn't right. They couldn't become transcendents at all. Therefore, at this time, they could only obediently obtain the benefits that they could get now. As for the rest, they could only wait until the time was right. Therefore, in the next moment, almost all the 6 tribulation experts began to wholeheartedly focus on the indescribable communication in the void. They carefully comprehended the various nutrients that were revealed in the communication that were of great benefit to their cultivation realm. Through this kind of absorption, their cultivation realm also began to rise bit by bit. Even those who were already at the peak of the 6 tribulation experts felt that the bottleneck between the 6 tribulation and 7 tribulation experts couldn't resist this kind of push. Under this push, it collapsed bit by bit and disintegrated bit by bit. Although this kind of collapse and disintegration seemed relatively insignificant compared to the incomparably stubborn bottleneck that was like a natural moat, it seemed that it would take countless years for it to completely collapse and disappear. However, the hope of improving was already attractive enough for them to wholeheartedly focus on it. During this process, time slowly passed. At some point, all the changes calmed down. The 6 tribulation experts felt that they had been separated from the other 6 tribulation experts. They were no longer in the void, but in an indescribable void. And that indescribable communication, that pushing force that constantly pushed their cultivation realm forward, had completely disappeared without a trace. It was so much so that even the connection they could sense with the other worlds had been completely lost. It was as if they were the only people left in the universe at this moment. What's going on? The 6 tribulation experts were all confused. However, very soon, all sorts of things that they had observed and sensed from the outside surfaced in the depths of their memories. The island branch has branched off again. As they recalled what they had seen before, they gradually came to this conclusion. So this is what happens when the island branches off. Most of the 6 tribulation experts felt that their curiosity had been satisfied. Of course, there were also a large number of 6 tribulation experts who felt inexplicably angry and extremely irritated at this moment. They began to cause all sorts of damage to their surroundings. However, this kind of damage only brought disaster to themselves. Their surroundings seemed to be like a spring. No matter what kind of attack or damage they caused, it would instantly rebound back to them, making them directly suffer the attacks and damage they had caused. Through this method, they were able to quickly stop their meaningless acts of destruction. Open up a new world first, then you will be able to contact the others again. At this moment, a voice spread throughout all the island branches. The minds of the 6 tribulation experts who were in a state of confusion. This voice belonged to the first transcendent expert who had transcended to the 6th tribulation. It was him who had directly used his authority as a transcendent expert to spread his voice to countless island branches, to all the 6 tribulation experts who had come later. This method seemed very incredible, but it was actually very simple. After all, as a sixth tribulation expert who had transcended the world, he had unimaginable authority in the island branches. His senses would not be limited by a single island branch, and he could easily transmit his information to the countless island branches. As for how to transmit this information to specific sixth tribulation experts, it was even simpler. Since his perception was not limited to the island branches, it could spread to countless island branches. Naturally, he could easily sense the existence of those six tribulation experts who were not in any world, but only in the gaps between the heavens and the earth. In this way, the six tribulation experts who had come later could receive his information. After receiving this information, the six tribulation experts naturally had different reactions. Some were doubtful, some were unhappy, and some were angry. However, when they could not think of any other way, they still started to do as the sixth tribulation powerhouse said, and started to split open the sky and earth in the void. As their world gradually took shape, they gradually felt the connection between their world and the other endless worlds. Then, they once again felt the endless world that existed among the countless island branches. Looks like the last fellow Taoist has appeared. The last sixth tribulation expert had just formed the world when he received this message from the world. Chapter 3140. The last sixth tribulation expert was slightly stunned. Then, he understood that they were going to have a meeting. Since they were going to have a meeting, they naturally couldn't treat each other as strangers like before. They naturally needed to communicate with each other. Of course, this kind of communication had to be done through the connection between the heavens and the earth. After all, it wasn't a face-to-face meeting. As a result, the sixth tribulation powerhouse who appeared last began to exchange information with the other sixth tribulation powerhouses. Not long after, he had completely integrated into the meeting. The one who held this meeting was naturally the first transcendent expert of the sixth tribulation level. The first transcendent at the level of the sixth tribulation was not too special before he transcended the world. In terms of cultivation, there were countless existences at the peak of the sixth tribulation like him. As for intelligence, he was only in the middle among the sixth tribulation experts. With all these conditions, one could imagine his position among the sixth tribulation experts. Although he was at the top, it was just barely. He didn't have any right to speak at all. However, this situation had completely changed after he became a transcendent being. After becoming a transcendent expert, he was the forerunner of all the transcendent experts of the sixth tribulation level. This was because he had the most experience of becoming a transcendent expert as a sixth tribulation expert. The other sixth tribulation experts were obviously inferior to him in this aspect. Although this didn't mean that the other sixth tribulation experts had to beg him to become a transcendent expert, but at least it showed that he had the ability to grant favors to other sixth tribulation experts who wanted to become transcendent experts. It was clear that the first transcendent who had reached the sixth tribulation had done so as well. In the process of many sixth tribulation experts becoming transcendent experts, he took the initiative to provide them with a lot of help, such as information and resources. For those sixth tribulation experts, this kind of help was actually not absolutely necessary. But it had to be admitted that with this help, it saved those sixth tribulation experts a lot of effort. With this kind of effect, the other sixth tribulation experts had no choice but to owe him favors. Once the number of sixth tribulation experts increased, the status of the first transcendent expert at the sixth tribulation expert level would naturally stand out, and he would no longer be the same as before. At the very least, his right to speak was many times greater than before. It was precisely because he had this right to speak that the meeting he convened with so many sixth tribulation powerhouses could go so smoothly. The other transcendents at the level of sixth tribulation did not interfere. Such a result would obviously increase his right to speak among the many sixth tribulation experts. It would give him more qualifications to intervene in more matters, and that would increase his right to speak once again. Just like that, it formed a cycle. It could be said that if this continued, the first transcendent at the sixth tribulation level would one day become an existence similar to the Alliance Master. It wasn't that the other sixth tribulation experts couldn't see this, but it was clear that this was not a conspiracy. In the end, even if the first transcendent expert of the sixth tribulation level obtained a position similar to that of the Alliance Master among the many sixth tribulation experts, it wouldn't be much of a loss for them. After all, someone with such authority was needed to gather all of them together to fight for benefits. Since there must be such an authority, what difference did it make if it was him or someone else? In any case, they themselves knew that it would be difficult for them to become such an authority. Because of this, even if the sixth tribulation experts could see through the thoughts of this transcendent expert, they just went with the flow and didn't take any action to cause trouble for him. At this time, this transcendent expert sensed the many connections in the world around him. A message was transmitted to those worlds according to his will, heading towards those sixth tribulation experts. This message was nothing else but a summary of the previous situation to those sixth tribulation experts. The previous situation was that the island branch was already in a perfect state, and it was time to give out the rewards. This reward was something that the sixth tribulation experts could sense: the incredible communication between the island branch and the ocean of nothingness in the outside world. Then, he told the sixth tribulation experts everything about the restrictions of this communication, how to reduce these restrictions, how to increase the benefits he could obtain from this communication, and so on. Of course, this wasn't because he had a strong spirit of sharing. It was because if the sixth tribulation experts knew about this, it would be beneficial to him. After all, if those sixth tribulation experts wanted to obtain more benefits, they had to open up more land for the island branch and work harder as laborers for the island branch. Once they did that, the speed and extent of growth of these island branches would be greatly enhanced. This kind of strengthening would clearly allow the island branches to communicate with the House of the Sea in the outside world more frequently and on a grander scale. This was clearly a good thing for the other transcendents who could benefit from such exchanges. That was why he was so proactive in sharing this information. As for why he hid in the world brought by his transcendence when the branch of the island was perfected, instead of merging into the great communication in the nothingness, he didn't hide anything and told the sixth tribulation powerhouses about it. In the world he had created through his transcendence, because the world itself was a part of the island branch, his presence here made the vast communication that had already fused with him become even more direct. If there had been a slight barrier between the two before, with the help of this world, it was as if this barrier didn't exist anymore. Having a barrier and not having a barrier were obviously two completely different concepts. If there was a barrier, no matter how small the barrier was, it wouldn't be perfect. If there was no barrier, no matter how small the gap between the barrier and the barrier was, it would be true perfection. There was an intrinsic difference between a matter that was truly perfect and not perfect. For example, the success rate of a matter was 99%. 99%. 99% was only 0.1% away from 100%. No matter how one looked at it, this gap was extremely small. However, was the difference between the two really as small as it seemed? A 100% success rate meant that no matter how many times it was done, no matter how many people repeated it, it would still succeed. However, a 99% success rate was obviously different. For most people, for most of the times, this matter could indeed succeed. It was no different from a normal 100% success rate. However, when there were enough repetitions, the success rate of this matter was 99%, and there would definitely be a number of failures. Compared to the overall number of times, these failures were not of much significance. In a statistical sense, they were almost negligible. But for those existences that just happened to have failed several times, the probability of failure was 100%. From this, it could be seen that a 100% success rate was a 100% success rate at all times. And sometimes a 99% success rate would become a 100% failure rate. This was the difference between perfection and non-perfection. In this place, between this branch of the island and the sea of nothingness outside, there was no barrier between them, which was the difference between perfection and perfection. It was easy to imagine how big the difference was. It went without saying how important it was to be able to integrate oneself into the exchange and become a perfect choice for a transcendent. Hearing that one could integrate oneself into the exchange and become a perfect choice, the sixth tribulation experts were extremely excited. They couldn't be any more clear on how serious the existence of that barrier would affect their integration into the communication. Previously, in the void, they wanted to cry but had no tears because of the barrier. They could clearly feel that the exchange had endless nutrients that could help them break through, but in the end, they couldn't completely immerse themselves in the nutrients because of the barrier. They couldn't wholeheartedly absorb the nutrient. That feeling was very uncomfortable. They had experienced it once, but they didn't want to experience it a second time. However, the reason why he felt so uncomfortable was mainly because the barrier between them was too strong, but from this it could be seen how much the barrier affected their integration into the exchange. Now that they heard that becoming a transcendent could eliminate that barrier, they were all overjoyed. They wanted to immediately become a transcendent and completely break that barrier. But what about those ants? Don't tell me they don't have a barrier too? A sixth tribulation expert suddenly asked curiously. This question spread throughout the world, where many sixth tribulation experts were located through the transmission of information. The ants he was referring to were naturally those who had transcended the world. In the eyes of the natives of the world, those who had transcended were already very powerful and incredible. But to the sixth tribulation experts, their strength was clearly at the level of ants. They didn't even need to make any real moves. With just a thought, they could mobilize a power that could completely erase them and directly kill them. In this way, those ordinary transcendent experts were naturally just ants in their eyes. All the other sixth tribulation experts knew what he was referring to. None of them doubted who he was referring to. Although the first transcendent didn't think that ordinary transcendent realm experts were ants, he didn't dwell on it. He simply said, "Of course there are no barriers." However, because they had only created an additional world for the island branch, the breadth of communication that they could sense was rather ordinary. It's not even 1/10,000,000th of what I sensed before. 1/10,000,000th? The sixth tribulation experts' expressions changed. Clearly, they had already discovered the hidden meaning behind the words of the first transcendent, a sixth tribulation expert. Ordinary supreme transcendents who had already created their own world could only sense 1/1,000,000th of the amount of communication that the first supreme transcendents at the level of the sixth tribulation had sensed. Then, what about them? What about the sixth tribulation experts who hadn't even created a world for the island? Was the communication that they had sensed just 1/1,000,000th of the communication that the first sixth tribulation overlord had sensed? So it's not just that the barrier is stronger. There's also a difference in the breadth. At this moment, an inexplicable desire surged in the hearts of the sixth tribulation experts. The previous 1/1,000,000th gap could bring them such great benefits under such a strong barrier. If the breadth was increased hundreds of millions of times and the barrier was completely removed, how much benefit would it bring them? Would it allow them to directly break through their limits and obtain the qualification to ascend to a higher level of Tao Master and become a seventh tribulation expert? Thinking of this, the sixth tribulation experts couldn't help but be tempted. Sensing the changes in the world, the first sixth tribulation expert revealed a faint smile. It was a good thing that they were tempted. With their help, the growth of this island branch would be even faster and smoother. In this case, the next time the island's branch was completed, the benefits he would gain would be even greater than this time. At this moment, the first sixth tribulation expert's heart skipped a beat. He turned his gaze to an empty void in the endless world. There, a space-time suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Then, it began to rise and sublimate. Before long, it had turned into a world. However, the change did not subside. It was still evolving towards a higher level. In other words, it was evolving towards the world. What's going on? It's not the work of any fellow Taoist. Why did the world form? This thought flashed through the mind of the first transcendent expert. He couldn't help but let his imagination run wild. In his senses, no matter if it was the sixth tribulation experts who came first or later, there was not much movement at this time. He could not sense any information belonging to those who came first or later in the transforming world. Therefore, he could be certain of one thing. Chapter 31:41. This doubt didn't linger in his mind for too long. Soon it disappeared. Because he had figured out the reason behind it. If it wasn't the sixth tribulation experts who came first or later, then it must be the cultivators who were born and raised in these island branches, and the most likely ones were those who had transcended. If one thought about it carefully, this seemed to conform to some hidden logic. For example, he now had two identities. One was a sixth tribulation expert, and the other was a transcendent expert. But now, he could stay in his own world like a transcendent expert and control all the changes in his world like the heavenly Tao. He could also step out of this world like other sixth tribulation experts and enter the void of this new island branch. According to the fate of a normal sixth tribulation expert, he would become a coolie for this island branch and open up more worlds for it. If he removed the prerequisite of his identity, he would be able to control everything in his world like the heavenly Tao, and he would also be able to open up more worlds for this island outside of his world. As for whether these two kinds of authority were really bound to those two identities as he had thought before, this was obviously not certain. According to the previous situation, the two kinds of authority seemed to correspond to each other. But what about the reality? Was it true that only sixth tribulation experts could be coolies? Could they help the island branch open up new worlds? In the past, he had thought that this was a matter of course. But after understanding these island branches more and more, he suddenly realized that this was just the wishful thinking of these sixth tribulation experts. For the island branches and the existences behind them, the most important thing was that these island branches could expand continuously. As long as they could achieve this goal, it didn't matter who was the sixth tribulation expert or some other existence that made the island branches expand. Who said that only sixth tribulation experts could obtain the authority to help the island branches open up new worlds in the void. If he was the existence behind the island branches, as long as they had the ability to open up new worlds in the void, they would be given such authority by him. Thinking of this, the situation couldn't be more obvious. It was only natural for those who had transcended to obtain that kind of authority. After all, those who had transcended obviously had the ability to open up new worlds in the void, and with this ability, they were qualified to be coolies. Naturally, they could obtain the authority to be coolies. If that's the case, the number of islands that will branch off this time will be countless times more than before. This thought suddenly flashed through the mind of the first sixth tribulation expert. He couldn't help but have a rather complicated expression. In fact, as he thought, at this time, in the sixth layer of the road to Tao Master, many sixth tribulation experts were shocked by the changes of the island branches this time. Originally, although the sixth tribulation powerhouses were shocked by the fact that this place had turned from an island into a huge object that spanned tens of thousands of layers of the void ocean, they were only shocked. After all, the extent of the change was understandable. The number of island branches obviously corresponded to the number of Sixth Tribulation experts who had stepped into the island branches, but this time, the situation was obviously far beyond their imagination. This time, the number of island branches that branched out again was not the number of Sixth Tribulation experts who had stepped into the island branches. Instead, it was tens of thousands of times more than this number. In the blink of an eye, the number of islands that were originally counted in the tens of thousands had jumped to a terrifying scale that needed to be counted in the hundreds of millions. The scale of the change was far beyond the imagination of all the Sixth Tribulation experts. They could not help but be shocked, and it was difficult to understand what had happened inside the island branches. How could it suddenly increase so much? Even if there is only one world in each island branch, the number of worlds is too beyond imagination. Those Sixth Tribulation experts were secretly shocked. As for the situation inside the islands, the Sixth Tribulation experts outside had already learned about it through various channels. They were no longer as clueless as before about the internal situation of the islands. At least, they knew that the inside of the island branches was a world of its own. It was precisely because of this that the number of branches on the island suddenly increased, which shocked them so much. At this time, more eyes from all over the island branches gathered on these island branches. There were even many disciples of the Tao Masters who had not paid attention to these island branches before, who now focused their attention on them. This situation had never happened before. At least, it had never happened in the sixth layer of the Tao Masters Road. Although billions of years had passed between the many worlds within the island's branch, it was impossible to tell how many billions of years had passed. But in fact, to the outside world, only a few hours had passed since the birth of the first island until it had branched out into hundreds of millions of other branches. For the Sixth Tribulation experts, such a short period of time was no different from a moment or a blink of an eye. Under such circumstances, even if the change was earth-shattering, even if it seemed to contain many unimaginable truths and mysteries, it was impossible to attract the attention of too many experts in the sixth layer of the Tao Masters Road. For a change to attract the attention of more existences, it would take time to brew. It was like a sudden light on a planet that dispelled all the darkness. It was enough for any living creature with eyes to easily notice it, no matter where they were on the planet. However, if the light just flashed by, and did not even exceed the reaction time of the living creature's vision, how many living creatures could notice the appearance of the light? Perhaps more living creatures would think that the flashing light was their own illusion, and even wonder if they had just blinked, and then mistook the change of light and darkness caused by blinking for that strange light. For those Sixth Tribulation experts, the island branches that appeared at this time were like the light. Although at first glance it was very unusual and incredible, as if it contained countless incredible truths and mysteries, and contained secrets that might allow countless Sixth Tribulation experts to break through the bottleneck and ascend. However, because the time it appeared was too short, therefore, most of the Sixth Tribulation experts did not have time to notice it. Therefore, before this, although it seemed to be very lively, and countless doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections of the Sixth Tribulation experts had already arrived here. However, in fact, these Sixth Tribulation experts only occupied a very small part of all the Sixth Tribulation experts on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. But this time, when the number of the island branches suddenly increased greatly, suddenly expanding from the level of tens of thousands to the level of hundreds of millions, this instantaneous change finally attracted the attention of almost all the Sixth Tribulation experts. From everywhere, even from those places of opportunities, they focused their attention on this place, on the many island branches that were scattered in the countless layers of the nothingness ocean layer. In just an instant, Luo Fan felt some kind of subtle pressure being transmitted over, waking him up from the state of consciousness that had transformed into countless branches of the island. There are actually so many sixth tribulation experts on this level? Feeling the pressure caused by the eyes, he could not help but feel inexplicably surprised. For the current him, the existence of the sixth tribulation experts, even to his incarnation, was just like an ant. The eyes of such existences could not bring much pressure to him, no matter what. But now, the eyes of so many sixth tribulation experts on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path could actually bring such a strong pressure to him and wake him up from that subtle state. How many sixth tribulation experts could do this? Just like air, a little air could not pressure living creatures at all. No living creature would ever be crushed to death by normal air. However, one day this air could actually produce such amazing pressure that it could actually wake up living creatures who could not feel the air pressure at all. It could be imagined how much air there was. I'm afraid that the number of practitioners on the 5th and 4th levels is not much less than the number of practitioners on the first 5 and 4 levels. After a slight calculation, he had already made a judgment in his heart. And this situation was obviously different from the logic he knew. Generally speaking, the higher the level, the more powerful the realm, the fewer existences there should be. In other words, the number of second tribulation experts should be less than that of entering tribulation experts. The number of third tribulation experts should be less than that of fifth tribulation experts. In this way, when one reached the level of sixth tribulation experts, it was obvious that the number of them should be much less than that of fifth tribulation experts. However, at this time, he found that the number of sixth tribulation experts, at least in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, was not much less than that of fifth tribulation experts. How could this not make him feel surprised? There must be some secret that I don't know about. At this moment, Luo Fan understood in his heart. The mystery of the Tao Master's path might not be as he had thought before. There might be more mysteries contained in it that he could not understand. And this difference in the number of practitioners was obviously one of the manifestations of those secrets. If it were me, how could I do this? How could I make the number of high-level practitioners, which should have been extremely small, become the same as the number of low-level practitioners? This idea came to Luo Fan's mind. The Tao Master's path was created by a true divine. The real secret was not something that Luo Fan, who was not a true divine, could fully understand. Therefore, it was obviously impossible to directly study the Tao Master's path and find out the mystery of the equal number of high-level practitioners and low-level practitioners by studying the Tao Master's path. Obviously, the only way was to bypass all means and directly start with the fundamental goal. That was to directly put himself in the position of the other party and consider what methods he needed to use to achieve that goal. The Tao Master's path itself exists in another time and space. The source of the practitioners is not the Tao Master universe of a certain period of time, but the past, present, and future of the Tao Master universe. If it were me, the best way to maintain the same number of cultivators at each level would be to limit the number of low-level cultivators according to the number of cultivators at the highest and most powerful level. Of course, there are many problems in this. For example, selecting practitioners from the past, present, and future is just a selection of the number of practitioners included in the first level of the Tao Master's path. There are no restrictions on how those practitioners can break through and how to step into the higher levels. It is difficult to specifically control the specific number of practitioners at each level. If I want to bypass this restriction, I must first accurately control the progress of each practitioner, and even control the progress of each practitioner. With this control, the frequency of the admission of practitioners at the first level will be within a range that will not break the balance. Thinking of this, Luo Fan only felt that only his eyes only lit up. It seemed that a doubt that had been in his heart for a long time had suddenly been cleared up. Yes, there must be some kind of control mechanism. Otherwise, all the practitioners should have stepped into the Tao Master's path at the same time. There will be no difference. At this moment, he remembered how he had stepped into the Tao Master's path. At that time, the process of him stepping into the Tao Master's path seemed to be a very ordinary process of breaking through a barrier and stepping into a certain special field. There was no special characteristic of transcending time at all. Now that he thought about it, in fact, the existence of this frequency control had already been revealed at that time. It should be like this. Only in this way can everything be explained clearly. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression became inexplicably complicated. He didn't feel too excited about finding the most likely secret among all of them, although it was indeed something to be happy about to find such a fact. However, compared with the result of the explanation of this fact, there was not much to be happy about, because this meant that the cultivation progress of almost all the experts in the tribulation realm, including him, had actually been predestined. Chapter 31:42. This kind of feeling would obviously not make anyone feel good. If the creator of the Tao Master Path was not a true saint, Luo Fan naturally did not think that it was something that he could not do even if he thought about it was true. However, the creator of the Tao Master Path was not someone else, but an existence at the true saint level. An existence at the level of a true saint had always been a destroyer of common sense. No matter how contrary to common sense it was, if it was a true saint, it would seem to be a matter of course. For example, things like controlling the cultivation potential and progress of billions of cultivators in the past, present, and future would obviously be nonsense if it was applied to any existence that was not a true saint. However, when it was applied to an existence at the true saint level, it did not seem to be surprising at all, and it even seemed to be a matter of course. After all, a true saint was omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient. They were eternal and indestructible. For such an existence, anything that was impossible seemed to be a matter of course for them. All kinds of complicated thoughts flowed through Luo Fan's mind, and his view of the Tao Master Path began to gradually change. In the past, he thought that he had a clear understanding of the true nature of the Tao Master Path in the previous few levels. However, now that he thought about it, his previous understanding of the Tao Master Path might be extremely one-sided. At least, before this, he had not discovered that the specific number of cultivators in the Tao Master Path was equal to each other. The fact that he did not discover this meant that he had missed many details on the path of becoming a Tao Master. In fact, there was evidence for this. His understanding of the specific number of cultivators in those levels of the Tao Master Path was based on a specious state. It seemed that there seemed to be only so many cultivators in those levels of the Tao Master Path, but if he dug carefully, he could find more cultivators from certain positions from time to time. After that, he just calculated logically that the number of cultivators would decrease by an order of magnitude with each increase in level. Relying on this understanding, he observed the levels of the Tao Master Path to determine the scale of the Tao Master Path. Obviously, his perception seemed to have unknowingly distorted his own senses, so that all the details of the road of Tao Master in his cognition seemed to conform to this logic. Only now, when he constructed an unprecedented spectacle that could attract the attention of a huge number of cultivators in an extremely short period of time, did he truly come into contact with the truth of quantity. If it's really as I think, it's just an illusion that I'm on par with the practitioners on the path of the Tao Master. After all, the number of cultivators on the Tao Master's path is just an illusion. It's an illusion after the number has been greatly reduced. At this moment, this idea was sealed in Luo Fan's heart. With this thought, a subtle perception spread to the entire sixth layer of the Tao Master's path. The sixth level of the Tao Master's road was not some other existence. It was not heaven and earth, nor was it a world, space-time, void, or nothingness. Even what Luo Fan was currently in contact with was a stretch of nothingness. There were more things that he had not come into contact with. In such a place, his invincible perception in general heaven and earth world, spacetime, void, nothingness, and even other things was obviously not as strong. At this time, although his perception was expanding in all directions endlessly, and more areas were included in his perception. However, within the scope of his perception, there were still too many secrets that his perception could not shake. These secret areas, in the scope of his perception, were like pieces of dark domains. At most, his perception could only rely on the perception of the edges of the dark domains to determine the existence of those dark domains. Even when he spread his perception to the extreme and expanded the scope of his perception to the maximum, he still did not come into contact with the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. In his perception, the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road was still a boundless existence. No matter how he probed, he could only detect an insignificant portion of this boundless existence. Even in this small part of the area that he could explore, there were too many areas that he could not explore in depth. These areas were of different sizes. Some were like dust, some were like heaven and earth, some were extremely small, and some were extremely vast. There were all kinds of them. And these dark domains did not include the heavens of the six tribulation experts. Although the heavens of the six tribulation experts could not be explored by Luo Fan, and he could only recognize their existence through the outline. However, because of the characteristics of the heavens, Luo Fan could perceive that they were heavens. Therefore, in his perception, it was not a dark domain, but a starry sky. However, that was all. After all, it was an area that his perception could not penetrate. It was already very rare to be able to determine that it was a starry sky. Not enough. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan knew that his detection was actually not enough. The goal that he wanted to find was still hidden in the heavy fog. However, although he realized this, he had to think of a new way to work, in which direction to work, how to lift the fog, and how to reveal the truth in front of him. This distortion of cognition is a kind of natural distortion, and it is also a certain setting of the Tao Master's Road. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The Tao Master's Road was created by those Tao Masters and true sages to cultivate new Tao Masters and new true sages. According to previous experience, all the arrangements here were actually to allow cultivators to obtain enlightenment and improve. Even the individual cultivators selected from the infinite timelines of the past, present, and future to be included in the Tao Master's Road by calculating the speed and progress of a cultivator's improvement was also to maintain the balance of the cultivators on each level of the Tao Master's Road. Why did the number of experts on each level of the Tao Master's Road not too many or too few? The ultimate goal was to allow the cultivators to obtain the best humanistic environment in the process. Wealth, companionship, method, and land were the four essentials of cultivation in the secular world. Although he had reached the level above the experts in the tribulation realm, these four essentials were actually not very accurate. However, the importance of companionship was not much different from that of the secular world. It was also extremely important. In the Tao Master's Road, the number of cultivators on each level was equal, which ensured that no matter which level a cultivator entered, he would have the same opportunity to meet the same number of cultivators. This was obviously of great benefit to the cultivator's cultivation. This kind of adjustment was like this, and the cognitive distortion that Luo Fan perceived now was very likely to be the same. It was also necessary for cultivation. With all kinds of thoughts in his mind, his perception began to explore in all directions. It was not in all directions, nor was it the difference in the direction of up and down, but the difference in the direction of exploration. For example, in different depths, different levels, different angles, different dimensions, and many other directions. His perception seemed to have become countless tiny tentacles, and began to explore the depths that he could not explore before, to other levels that he could not explore before, to explore the angles that he had not thought of, and to explore the dimensions that he had not found before. At first, he naturally found nothing. However, very soon, he felt a subtle change appearing in his perception. Vaguely, there seemed to be some kind of invisible limit appearing in front of his perception, making him unable to discover something that seemed to have been discovered. Found it. Although he felt the limit, Luo Fan was not surprised at this moment. Instead, he was happy. His perception felt obstructed, which seemed to be a kind of trouble. But in fact, this meant that he had already found the right direction. It was just like the improvement of the cultivation realm. If you don't first touch the bottleneck, how can you break through? At this time, his perception was the same. Sensing the existence of this obstacle, it also meant that the road to breakthrough was close. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and his perception began to produce all kinds of indescribable adjustments. At the same time, his worldview also began to implement his own perception more strongly. Even though his perception had already fused with his worldview, it was still impossible for him to comprehend it. However, this kind of integration was only a kind of uniform integration after all. It was like ink and water fusing together. After ink and water fused together, the two naturally became indistinguishable, and the color of all the liquids would also be completely distinguished from the two. On the whole, they became the same kind of liquid, and it was no longer possible to tell that they were fused liquid. The fusion of his worldview, his perception, and even everything that belonged to him was the same. Such a fusion indeed allowed everything he had to be implemented by his worldview, and it could make his worldview truly become his true foundation. However, at the same time, doing so also made it difficult for him to exert the true power of his worldview. It was like ink and water fusing together. It did indeed turn the clear water into some kind of colored liquid, but at the same time, as the magical function of ink for writing, the fused liquid had obviously lost most of its function. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to truly exert the original magical function of ink for writing, of course, he could only regather the ink in the fused liquid and recondense the black or other colors in it. Only then could the magical function of writing reappear. At this time, when Luo Fan forcefully implemented his worldview into his perception, it was similar to recondensing the colors in the ink. This wouldn't change the characteristics of his perception that had already fused with his worldview, but it could greatly enhance the magical function of his perception in some aspects. For example, the magical function of breaking the distortion of perception. This kind of enhancement wouldn't be too great. After all, his perception had already fused with his worldview, and it already had various characteristics after fusing with the worldview. At this time, if he further implemented the worldview, it would at most be slightly enhanced on top of perfection. Therefore, before he came into contact with that kind of obstacle, or rather, before he really stood at the door, the effect of this enhancement wouldn't be too great. But now, his perception was clearly already standing in front of that obstacle, and he was already standing at the door of that new world. Under such circumstances, this kind of enhancement seemed to be extremely important. As he carried out the world view of laws into his perception, he suddenly discovered that some kind of inexplicable shackles had suddenly broken. It wasn't until the shackles broke that he discovered the existence of such subtle shackles on his body. It was only then that he discovered that there was actually some kind of shackles on his perception, his mind, his cognition, his body, his soul, his strength, his might, his divine sense, his ideas, and even his world view. As this shackle broke, he suddenly felt that the sixth level of the Tao Master's road within his perception range suddenly lit up. Many dark domains that he couldn't see clearly before were suddenly seen clearly by him. Of course, there were still a large part of the dark domains that were still the same, which he still couldn't see clearly. But the part of the dark domains that he could see almost subverted his understanding of the sixth level of the Tao Master's road. In those dark domains, there were all kinds of strange existences. Among them, some were heavens, some were world groups, some were heaven groups, some were chaotic dimensions, some were islands, some were heaven and earth groups, some were worlds, some were spacetime, some were fog, some were stars, some were continents, some were all kinds of man-made objects, and even some were magic treasures and celestial devices at a glance. And among those existences there were a large number of auras of sixth tribulation expert. The amount of information that Luo Fan felt at this time had already exceeded the number of sixth tribulation experts that he had previously known. Moreover, it wasn't the number of sixth tribulation experts that he had known when he first stepped onto the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, but the number that he had realized after he felt those peeping eyes. It was equivalent to the number of fifth tribulation experts on the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road. In just the blink of an eye, the entire sixth level of the Tao Master's Road had already increased by tens of thousands of times in his eyes. And this was only the increase in his perception range.